My name is Maya. I am 35 years old and I am a senior hospital risk manager at a major urban trauma center in Chicago. 30 years ago, a man abandoned me in the middle of a crowded shopping mall and never looked back. I spent decades carrying that heavy silence, wondering why I was not worth staying for. Now that same man is lying in a hospital bed, reaching out with trembling hands and pleading with me, as if I am the only thing he has left in this world. He actually expects me to forget everything and use my power to save his life. He has no idea the kind of person I have become and exactly what I am capable of doing. Before I tell you what I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you are watching from and what time it is in the comments below. The chaos of a hospital emergency room on a Friday night is a living, breathing thing. As the senior risk manager, my job is to protect the hospital from massive legal liabilities before they happen. When the overhead speaker blared a code blue for Trauma Bay 4, I did not flinch. A nurse flagged me down in the hallway holding a digital intake tablet. She said we had an uninsured John Doe who just collapsed outside the sliding glass doors and his condition was deteriorating fast. The hospital protocol for uninsured trauma patients requires immediate administrative clearance to approve extreme life-saving measures without a financial guarantor. I pushed through the heavy swinging double doors of Trauma Bay 4. The room smelled sharply of sterile antiseptic and bitter sweat. A team of 6 doctors worked frantically over a frail older man whose skin was a terrible shade of ashen gray. Machines beeped in a frantic, uneven rhythm. I stepped close to the metallic bed to scan his digital intake file and verify his identity against the sparse details the paramedics managed to pull from his leather wallet. I held the tablet securely in my left hand and scrolled through the available patient data. Name Richard. No last name provided. Date of birth matched the year 1960. Blood pressure crashing rapidly. As I leaned over to check the plastic wristband for a matching identification number, a cold, damp hand shot out and clamped around my right wrist. The grip was shockingly tight for a man who looked half dead. I snapped my head down. My eyes locked onto the patient. The heart monitors blared loudly around us, but the sound completely vanished from my ears. I knew those eyes. I knew the sharp angle of his jaw and the jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. 30 years of aging and sickness could not erase the face of the man who left me standing alone by a rack of winter coats at a Sears department store when I was just 5 years old. It was Richard, my biological father. I froze completely. The tablet slipped slightly in my hand. I expected him to be confused or delirious from the intense physical pain. Instead, his eyes were crystal clear and burning with a desperate, calculated intensity. He did not look surprised to see me standing there. He looked exactly like a man who knew exactly who he was grabbing. His fingers dug deeper into my skin, bruising my wrist. He pulled himself up just a fraction of an inch from the bloody hospital mattress. He did not apologize. He did not say he missed me. He did not ask how I survived the last 3 decades without his protection or love. He stared directly into my face, and his voice cut through the chaotic noise of the trauma bay with absolute entitlement. "Maya, you have to save me." The sheer audacity of his demand hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The trauma doctors shouted for me to step back immediately so they could push a heavy dose of epinephrine into his failing veins. I ripped my arm out of his grasp. The air in the sterile room suddenly felt incredibly thin and hard to breathe. I took a slow, deliberate step away from the metal bed. The terrified little girl who waited in that mall died a long time ago. The woman standing in this trauma bay was a ruthless executive who destroyed fraudulent lawsuits for a living. I looked down at the man gasping for air on the table. My face remained completely blank. I pressed the button on the tablet, locking the screen. I turned my back to him and walked straight toward the swinging doors. The nurse called out for the clearance code. I never looked back. The heavy sliding doors of Trauma Bay 4 did not just open, they practically exploded inward, hitting the wall with a violently loud thud. I had barely taken 3 steps away from the metal hospital bed when the sudden noise forced me to turn back around. A man stormed into the sterile emergency room, bringing an aggressive wave of expensive cologne and absolute chaos with him. He looked to be in his early 30s, and he was dressed in a sharp navy blue tailored suit that screamed of generational wealth and unchecked privilege. He wore a heavy gold watch on his left wrist, and his polished leather shoes slipped slightly on the freshly mopped hospital floor. This was Liam. I did not need a formal introduction to know exactly who he was. He had the exact same sharp jawline, the exact same straight nose, and the exact same arrogant posture as the man currently bleeding on the table behind me. This was the son Richard chose to keep. This was the golden child he decided was worth staying for after he left me standing all alone by a rack of winter coats in a department store. Liam did not even glance at the heart monitors, and he did not look at the team of exhausted trauma doctors trying to push oxygen into his father. He immediately began shouting at the top of his lungs, demanding to know who was in charge of this disorganized facility. His voice carried the distinct tone of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He pointed a manicured finger at the head nurse and demanded a private luxury suite for his father immediately. The head nurse tried to calmly explain that this was a level 1 trauma center and that Richard was actively crashing, but Liam waved his hand dismissively in her face. He told her he did not care about standard hospital procedures or emergency protocols. He announced that his father was a highly important man who required VIP treatment, and he demanded the chief of medicine be paged directly to the room. The sheer audacity of his demands in the middle of a literal life or death situation made the entire medical team freeze for a fraction of a second. The trauma doctors exchanged irritated looks but kept working. Then Liam stopped shouting at the medical staff. His eyes darted across the crowded room and landed directly on me. I was wearing my dark grey hospital administration blazer and holding the digital intake tablet tightly against my chest. Liam immediately assumed I was just a low-level floor manager or perhaps a patient liaison assistant meant to cater to upset families in the waiting area. He marched straight up to me, invading my personal space until he was barely an inch away from my face. He snapped his fingers aggressively in my direction and ordered me to stop standing around like a useless idiot. He told me to get on my radio right now and clear out the entire intensive care unit so his father could have a private floor without being bothered by regular patients. He demanded I fetch the necessary paperwork to transfer Richard to a private concierge medical team. He spoke to me like I was something he had scraped off the bottom of his expensive leather shoe. I simply stared at him. I did not blink, and I did not say a single word. My complete lack of obedience seemed to infuriate him even more. His face turned a deep shade of red, and the veins in his neck popped. He took another step forward, attempting to physically intimidate me by towering over my smaller frame. He loudly proclaimed that he had made a six-figure donation to this exact hospital last year, and he swore he could have me fired and blacklisted from the medical community before my shift even ended if I did not immediately do exactly what he commanded. I stood completely still, analyzing his erratic behavior the same way I would analyze a medical malpractice lawsuit. Before I could calmly explain that I was the senior risk manager who held the power to have him physically removed by armed security, a weak and raspy voice cut through the heavy tension in the room. It was Richard. He was struggling violently against the clear plastic oxygen mask strapped to his pale face. He lifted a trembling, heavily bruised hand and pointed a frail finger directly at me. He told Liam to stop shouting immediately. He forced the painful words out between agonizing, wet breaths. He told Liam that I was not a nurse and I was not a low-level secretary. He told his golden son to look very closely at my face. Richard swallowed hard, and his monitors beeped rapidly as he confessed to Liam that the woman standing in front of him holding the tablet was Maya. The busy emergency room went completely still. Liam stopped breathing. He took a sudden heavy step back, as if the solid floor beneath his expensive shoes had just vanished into thin air. His dark eyes grew wide as he scanned my facial features frantically, looking for the biological resemblance. He knew my name. The realization hit me instantly like a cold bucket of water. Richard had actually told his new perfect family about me. They fully knew I existed out there in the world. Liam knew he had an older half-sister, but he clearly, never in a million years, expected to run into me in a dirty emergency room while demanding VIP service and threatening my job. I watched the arrogant fire completely drain out of his dark eyes, replaced by a sudden and deeply calculating flash of recognition. He looked back at his dying father, coughing on the table, and then he looked back at my hospital administration badge pinned to my lapel. He saw my official title printed clearly in bold black letters, Senior Risk Manager. Liam realized in that exact horrifying moment that the quiet woman he had just threatened to fire was actually the highest-ranking executive currently working on the floor. He realized I held the ultimate authority over all hospital protocols, financial waivers, and critical patient transfers. The transformation in his entire demeanor was deeply unsettling and fascinating to watch. It was exactly like a mechanical switch flipped inside his brain. The aggressive, entitled bully vanished completely into thin air and was instantly replaced by a smooth, manipulative corporate salesman. Liam frantically smoothed down the wrinkled lapels of his expensive suit and forced a deeply unnatural smile onto his face. He took a slow, cautious step toward me this time, keeping his hands open and entirely non-threatening. His loud voice suddenly dropped to a soft, pleading tone that sounded entirely rehearsed and fake. He said my name softly, rolling it off his tongue, as if we were old childhood friends catching up after a long time apart. He said he had always deeply hoped we would meet one day under much better circumstances than this. He tried to reach out and touch my shoulder to establish a fake sense of familial warmth and brotherly connection. I took a hard step back, completely out of his reach. He let his hand fall to his side, but he kept that fake, desperate smile plastered on his face. He quickly explained the real terrifying reason they were so desperate and why Richard was crashing. Richard did not just collapse from a random minor heart issue. His liver was completely failing due to a severe chronic condition, and his health had been secretly rapidly declining for several months. Liam told me his father needed a full organ transplant immediately to survive the week. Then came the true demand. He dropped the charming brotherly act entirely and leaned in extremely close, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone so the busy nurses and doctors could not hear his illegal request. Liam told me he knew exactly how hospital administration worked behind closed doors. He knew that as the senior risk manager, I had the top-level administrative override codes to bypass the strict federal organ waitlist protocols. He wanted me to log into the secure national registry system and flag Richard as a priority. One emergency status, moving him to the very top of the list above sick patients who had been patiently waiting for years. He looked me dead in the eyes, completely serious, and demanded I use my hard-earned executive power to break federal medical law and save the father who threw me away. He stood there, expecting me to just erase 30 years of pure trauma and risk my entire career simply because we shared the exact same blood. He really believed I would sacrifice myself for them. I stared at Liam as his ridiculous demand hung in the heavy, sterile hospital air. He actually expected me to commit a massive federal crime for a man I had not seen in 3 decades. He genuinely wanted me to log into the highly secure national organ sharing database and actively manipulate the incredibly complex algorithmic system. He wanted me to deliberately bump a man who had abandoned me to the very top of the transplant list, displacing countless innocent patients who had been desperately fighting for their lives and following the strict medical rules for years. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of his request was almost physically suffocating. I looked slowly from Liam to the frail man coughing on the metal bed and then back to Liam. My voice was completely flat and totally devoid of any familial warmth or hesitation. I told him absolutely no. I explained clearly that the National Organ Registry is governed by incredibly strict federal laws and complex algorithms based purely on medical viability and documented wait times, not the desperate illegal demands of a guilty son trying to save his own conscience. I explained that even if I possessed the highest level administrative override codes, which I absolutely did, I would never, under any circumstances, use them to commit medical fraud for a complete stranger. The word stranger seemed to physically strike Liam across the face. He visibly flinched, and his fake, warm brotherly smile instantly shattered into a million pieces. He defensively reminded me that the dying man on the bed was my actual biological father. I corrected him immediately without missing a single beat. I told him Richard was simply a biological contributor who permanently voided his parental rights the exact second he decided to leave a terrified 5-year-old child completely alone in a massive shopping mall. Unquote. Liam realized his pathetic attempt at emotional brotherly bonding had completely failed. His handsome face hardened and his dark eyes turned incredibly vicious. He aggressively grabbed my right upper arm tightly and practically dragged me out of the busy, chaotic trauma bay and into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the adjoining quiet corridor. I violently yanked my arm out of his tight grip the very second we cleared the heavy, swinging double doors. The hallway was relatively empty, giving him the perfect, isolated space to drop his corporate charm act completely. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, backing me up against the cold, painted cinder block wall. The polished, wealthy salesman was gone entirely and was instantly replaced by a cornered and incredibly dangerous animal. He lowered his voice into a vicious, venomous whisper that echoed slightly in the empty hall. He told me I was making a massive and catastrophic mistake. He said I had absolutely no idea who I was messing with or exactly how much financial and social power his family wielded in this city. I stayed perfectly still, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me physically intimidated by his wealthy posturing. Liam sneered at me and delivered his ultimate calculated threat. He said if I did not walk straight back into my private office and put Richard at the very top of that national transplant list by midnight, he would systematically and completely dismantle my entire professional life. He promised to go directly to the local news media and spin a horrific sensationalized story. He swore he would tell the entire world that the senior risk manager of this prestigious hospital intentionally denied life-saving emergency care to her own sick father out of pure petty childhood spite. He said he would vividly paint me as a deeply unstable and vindictive woman who deliberately abused her massive administrative power to execute a personal vendetta against a helpless old man. He promised to personally make sure the State Medical Ethics Board permanently revoked my administrative licenses and that I would never ever work in healthcare management again. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit, fully expecting me to crumble completely under the heavy, crushing weight of his threats. He clearly expected the terrified, abandoned little girl from the department store to suddenly surface and beg him for mercy. He fundamentally and completely misunderstood exactly who I was. I did not raise my voice, and I did not break my intense eye contact. I looked directly at him with absolute cold clinical detachment. I calmly informed him that he was currently standing in a highly secure and heavily restricted area of a level 1 trauma center. I slowly raised my hand and pointed an index finger to the black security camera mounted securely on the ceiling directly above his head. I told him that specific camera had just recorded him physically grabbing a senior hospital executive and aggressively cornering her in a restricted medical corridor. I told him in a dangerously quiet voice that if he ever touched me again or attempted to threaten my professional career, I would not just have him physically removed by armed hospital security, I would have him formally arrested for battery and criminal trespassing. I watched the arrogant color drain slightly from his face as his dark eyes darted nervously up to the glowing red recording light of the security camera. I smoothly straightened the lapels of my dark gray blazer and told him to get out of my hospital. I turned on my heel and walked away. The sharp, rhythmic click of my shoes on the hard linoleum floor echoed loudly in the quiet hallway. I felt a massive, incredible surge of absolute clarity. The terrifying ghost that had haunted my entire childhood was finally dead to me. I rounded the sharp corner, heading directly toward the safety of the main administrative elevators. I took a deep, heavy breath, feeling physically lighter than I had in over 30 years. But that incredible feeling of triumph did not even last a full 60 seconds. Before I could even reach out to press the metal call button for the elevator, my cell phone began to vibrate violently and relentlessly in my blazer pocket. It was not a standard text message alert. It was the distinct, rapid chiming sound of the Emergency Hospital Board Administrative Notification System. I quickly pulled the phone out and looked down at the glowing, bright screen. My stomach instantly dropped like a heavy stone. Liam had not been bluffing, and he had not wasted a single second. The urgent notification was a massive high-priority email sent directly to every single executive member of the hospital board, including the vice president of operations and the chief of medicine. The subject line was flagged with extreme critical importance. Liam had already filed a formal emergency legal grievance claiming catastrophic medical negligence and gross ethical violations by the senior risk manager. He had officially initiated a massive corporate war. Conflict 2 had officially begun before I even made it back to my desk. Monday morning arrived with the heavy gray skies typical of late autumn in Chicago. I drove into the hospital parking garage right at 6 in the morning, seeking the quiet sanctuary of my office before the administrative floors woke up. I held a black coffee in one hand and my leather briefcase in the other. I swiped my security badge at the private executive elevator. The light flashed green and the heavy metal door slid open. Everything felt completely normal. I walked down the silent carpeted hallway toward the risk management suite. I unlocked my office door and sat down in my ergonomic leather chair. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar smell of industrial cleaner and paper files ground me. I pressed the power button on my dual monitors and waited for the hospital portal login screen to appear. I typed my employee identification number and my highly secure password just like I had done every single morning for the last 5 years. I pressed enter. Instead of the familiar blue dashboard loading my daily risk assessment files, the screen flashed a bright, harsh red. The text on the monitor displayed a stark, terrifying message. Access denied. Administrative privileges suspended. Please contact Human Resources immediately. I frowned and tried typing my credentials a second time, assuming it was just a routine mandatory software update or a temporary server glitch. The red screen flashed again. My heart rate ticked up slightly. As a senior risk manager, being locked out of the system was never an accident. It meant you were actively under investigation or you were already fired. I reached for my desk phone to call the information technology department, but before my fingers even grazed the plastic receiver, my office door burst open. My executive assistant, Sarah, stood in the doorway breathing heavily, as if she had just sprinted up all 6 flights of stairs. Her face was incredibly pale and her eyes were wide with genuine panic. She did not say good morning. She did not bring me my daily schedule. She just walked straight up to my desk and placed her personal cell phone directly in front of me. The screen was already playing a video. I looked down and my entire world stopped spinning. It was a local news segment, but the footage playing on the screen was not shot by a professional camera crew. It was raw, shaky cell phone footage taken from inside Trauma Bay 4 on Friday night. Liam had recorded me. He had secretly held his phone down by his waist while I was standing over our dying father. But the video was not showing the truth. It was a viciously calculated and highly edited masterpiece of pure character assassination. Liam had completely muted the audio of his own voice, threatening me and demanding illegal VIP treatment. He had completely cut out the part where Richard grabbed my arm and demanded I save him. Instead, the video only showed an isolated, silent clip of me staring down at a helpless gray-haired man actively dying on a hospital bed. The footage was dramatically slowed down to make my naturally calm, resting face look incredibly cold and purely malicious. I watched myself on the small screen as I forcefully ripped my arm away from the frail old man and coldly turned my back to walk out of the room. The local news anchor doing the voiceover for the clip sounded deeply disgusted. The anchor called it a shocking display of absolute cruelty by a high-ranking hospital executive. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen in bold yellow letters read, "Heartless hospital boss abandons dying senior citizen in emergency room." The news anchor explained that the poor elderly patient was completely uninsured and destitute, and that the hospital risk manager had personally denied him life-saving care purely to save the hospital a few $1,000s. Liam had officially gone to the local media just like he promised. He did not just post it on a small blog. He sent it to the biggest morning news station in the entire city. Sarah scrolled down to the comment section with a trembling finger. There were already thousands of angry comments from local residents. People were calling for my immediate termination. People were posting the address of the hospital and demanding a protest. People were calling me a monster who did not deserve a medical license. Liam had expertly weaponized the public against me, framing himself and Richard as innocent victims of a greedy corporate healthcare machine. He knew exactly how much the general public hated hospital administrators, and he threw me directly to the wolves. The sheer calculated evil of his plan was almost impressive, if it were not actively destroying my entire life. He knew the hospital board would never care about the truth if the public relations nightmare was bad enough. The corporate medical world operates on pure optics, and my optics currently looked like absolute pure evil. Before I could even hand the cell phone back to Sarah, the heavy wooden door to my office opened again. This time, it was not a friend. Two large men in dark grey suits walked into my office. They were from the Hospital Internal Security Division. Behind them stood the Director of Human Resources holding a thick manila folder tight against her chest. The director did not smile. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep professional dread. She told me I needed to step away from my desk immediately and hand over my hospital identification badge. I did not argue, and I did not raise my voice. I knew the protocol perfectly because I was usually the one writing the protocol for these exact situations. I reached up and unclipped my security badge from my lapel, dropping it silently onto the glass surface of my desk. I stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles in my dark grey suit. I walked out of my office flanked by the two large security guards. The walk to the executive boardroom felt like a public execution. We had to pass through the main administrative bullpen to reach the executive wing. Every single person in the massive open office stopped what they were doing and stared at me. Telephones rang completely ignored. Keyboards stopped clicking. I could feel dozens of eyes burning into the back of my neck. Some of my colleagues looked shocked, while others whispered quietly behind their hands. The video had clearly already spread through the entire hospital internal network. I kept my chin parallel to the floor, and my eyes focused straight ahead, refusing to show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I was walking directly into a slaughterhouse, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me bleed before the doors even closed. We reached the end of the long corridor, and the security guards opened the heavy oak doors to the main executive boardroom. The room was freezing cold and smelled strongly of polished wood and expensive coffee. Sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table was Marcus Sterling, the Vice President of Hospital Operations. Marcus was a ruthless corporate operator who cared about exactly one thing in the entire world, which was the financial stock and public reputation of his hospital. He was sitting with his hands folded tightly in front of him, and his tablet was playing the news clip on a continuous silent loop. 3 other senior board members sat quietly along the sides of the table, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. I walked in and took the single empty chair situated directly at the opposite end of the long table. The security guard stepped outside and pulled the heavy doors shut, sealing me inside the room. Marcus looked up from his tablet, and his eyes were completely devoid of any professional warmth. He did not ask me how my weekend was. He did not ask for my side of the story. He pushed the tablet slightly forward so the looping video of my face was visible to everyone in the room. He told me that the hospital switchboard had received over 400 angry phone calls since 6 o'clock yesterday evening. He said local politicians were already demanding a full state investigation into our emergency room financial clearance practices. He told me that the hospital board was officially convening an emergency disciplinary hearing right this very second. Marcus leaned forward and explicitly stated that unless I could provide an absolutely bulletproof explanation for why I seemingly abandoned a dying elderly man in our own trauma center, they were going to terminate my employment with extreme prejudice and publicly offer me up as a scapegoat to satisfy the angry mob. I sat perfectly still in the expensive leather chair. I looked at Marcus, and then I looked at the video of Liam framing me. Conflict 2 had officially reached its peak, and the trap was perfectly set. It was finally my turn to speak. I sat perfectly still in the expensive leather chair and looked around the massive mahogany table. The 4 senior board members stared back at me with cold judgment, expecting me to break down in tears. They expected me to offer a pathetic, emotional apology and beg for my job. They wanted me to grovel so they could cleanly terminate my employment and issue a public relations apology to the press by noon. I looked directly at Marcus Sterling. I did not cry, and my voice did not shake even a fraction of an inch. I calmly informed the vice president of hospital operations that I had absolutely no intention of resigning and I would not be accepting any disciplinary action today. The sheer confidence in my voice caused a visible ripple of shock across the room. One board member scoffed loudly and muttered that my arrogance was astounding given the public relations nightmare currently unfolding on local television. I ignored the comment entirely and kept my eyes locked on Marcus. I told him that as the senior risk manager, my primary contractual duty was to protect the hospital from catastrophic financial and legal liabilities. I explained that the highly edited video playing on his tablet was not a tragic documentation of medical neglect, but rather a deliberate smokescreen designed to hide a massive criminal fraud scheme currently being perpetrated against this hospital. Marcus narrowed his eyes and paused the video. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, demanding to know exactly what I was talking about. I calmly reminded the board that before Human Resources suspended my administrative network privileges this morning, I had already initiated a standard preliminary background check on the patient in Trauma Bay 4. I told Marcus that since I was currently locked out of my own dashboard, he would need to log into the secure financial intake server using his executive credentials. I instructed him to pull up the raw, unedited admission files for the patient named Richard. Marcus hesitated for a moment, clearly irritated by my authoritative tone, but his corporate curiosity won. He tapped the screen of his tablet and entered his secure password, navigating to the hospital billing and intake database. I told him to project the file onto the large digital presentation screen mounted on the wall behind him so the entire board could review the documents together. A few seconds later, the massive screen illuminated the dark room with the stark white background of a standard hospital financial intake form. I stood up slowly from my leather chair and walked deliberately toward the front of the room. I was no longer the accused employee defending my job. I was the senior forensic investigator walking my subordinates through a crime scene. I pointed to the first section of the projected document. I asked Marcus to read the primary insurance status declared by the patient upon admission. Marcus adjusted his glasses and read aloud that the patient claimed to be entirely uninsured and completely destitute. I nodded and pointed to the secondary financial declaration section. I explained to the silent room that Richard and his son Liam had formally applied for emergency hospital charity funds immediately upon entering the building. Our hospital maintains a highly publicized multi-million-dollar philanthropic fund, specifically designed to cover extreme life-saving measures for homeless individuals and poverty-stricken patients who have absolutely no financial safety net. I explained that by claiming total destitution, Richard bypassed the standard billing verification process and was instantly fast-tracked for emergency charity resources. One of the female board members interrupted me, stating that this information only made my actions look infinitely worse. She argued that the patient was clearly a vulnerable and impoverished senior citizen, making my refusal to assist him a catastrophic ethical failure. I looked at her with a completely blank expression and told her to let me finish my forensic presentation before jumping to ignorant conclusions. The room went dead silent again. I moved my hand down the projected screen and pointed to the emergency contact information section. I told the board that when criminals attempt to defraud massive medical institutions, they almost always focus so heavily on hiding their main assets that they make stupid, careless mistakes on the standard administrative paperwork. I told Marcus to read the listed address for Richard's primary emergency contact. Marcus squinted at the screen and read the address aloud. It was a property located in the highly exclusive and heavily gated residential district of Oakbrook. I instructed Marcus to open a new tab on his web browser and navigate directly to the Public Property Tax Assessment database for the state of Illinois. I told him to type that exact Oakbrook address into the search bar and display the current ownership records for the entire room to see. Marcus typed the information slowly, his jaw tightening as he began to realize that I was leading him toward a massive revelation. The public tax database loaded onto the large screen. The property listed as the emergency contact address was not a small apartment or a modest suburban home. It was a sprawling luxury estate. I read the public property details aloud, letting every single word echo in the quiet boardroom. The property featured 6 bedrooms, an indoor swimming pool, and a temperature-controlled wine cellar. The current market value of the estate was officially listed at $2.5 million. The board members stared at the screen in complete stunned silence. I walked back toward the mahogany table and placed both of my hands flat against the polished wood, leaning in close to Marcus. I lowered my voice into a cold, calculating tone. I explained that the destitute senior citizen currently bleeding our charity fund dry and demanding illegal bypasses for federal organ transplants was legally tied to a $2.5 million estate. I explained that his son Liam, the man who filmed the vicious smear campaign video, was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a $10,000 gold watch in the emergency room while actively demanding concierge medical service. I looked directly into Marcus Sterling's eyes and told him the absolute truth. I told him that Richard and Liam were not helpless victims of a broken healthcare system. They were highly sophisticated, wealthy grifters, actively committing massive federal Medicaid fraud and felony intake fraud against our hospital. I explained that if I had authorized the emergency organ bypass using the hospital charity fund, as Liam demanded, our entire institution would have been legally complicit in a multi-million-dollar federal crime. I told the board that the state medical ethics committee would not just revoke my licenses, they would launch a full federal raid on this hospital, and every single executive sitting in this room would be facing federal prison time for aiding and abetting medical charity fraud. The heavy, suffocating tension in the room shifted instantly. The aggressive, judgmental posture of the board members completely dissolved into pure corporate panic. The vice president of operations looked at the $2.5 million property valuation on the screen, and his face turned entirely pale. He realized in that exact moment that I had not abandoned a dying man at all. I had single-handedly stopped the hospital from walking blindfolded into a catastrophic federal indictment. I stood perfectly straight and smoothed the lapels of my dark gray suit. I told Marcus that I did not deny Richard care out of cruelty. I flagged his account because my forensic risk algorithms detected glaring inconsistencies in his financial declarations, and I was legally obligated to halt all administrative bypasses until a full financial audit could be conducted. It was a brilliant, calculated lie constructed entirely from the truth. I used their own corporate greed and fear of federal prison to completely shield myself. I told the board that Liam went to the news media and fabricated that video specifically to panic the hospital administration. Liam wanted the board to fire me immediately so his father could slip through the chaotic administrative cracks and steal a new liver on the hospital charity dime before anyone noticed the missing $2.5 million. Marcus Sterling swallowed hard and closed the web browser on his tablet. He looked up at me with a completely different expression. The corporate hostility was gone, replaced by a sudden desperate need for my expertise. He asked me quietly what our next immediate move should be to protect the hospital from the ongoing media fallout and the active fraud attempt. I did not smile, but a deep wave of immense satisfaction washed over my entire body. I had completely flipped the power dynamic of the room in less than 10 minutes. I told Marcus my first demand was the immediate and full reinstatement of my administrative network privileges and a formal written apology from Human Resources. I told him we were going to let the local news media run with their dramatic story for exactly 24 more hours, allowing Liam to publicly dig his own grave as deep as possible. Then I promised the board I would personally deliver the irrefutable proof of the fraud to federal authorities and the hospital legal team. I told them I was going to systematically dismantle the entire fake narrative Liam had built and use my unhindered executive access to dig into every single financial record attached to that $2.5 million estate. The board members nodded in rapid, desperate agreement. Conflict 2 had just ended with my total victory, but as I looked closely at the property ownership name listed on the large screen, a completely new and dangerous mystery presented itself. The estate was not registered in Liam or Richard's name at all. The registered owner of the $2.5 million property was an LLC controlled by a woman named Jada Vance. Marcus Sterling practically tripped over his own expensive leather shoes rushing to unlock my system access. The board members filed out of the room, looking like scolded children terrified of the massive federal compliance disaster I had just prevented. I did not smile or gloat. I simply gathered my files and walked out. The main administrative floor was still buzzing with nervous rumors about my imminent firing, but when I walked past the cubicles with my head held high, the whispers died instantly. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to my private office. My assistant Sarah jumped out of her chair looking at me with wide eyes, fully expecting me to pack my belongings into a cardboard box. Instead, I sat down at my desk and pressed the power button on my dual monitors. The screen flashed bright blue, and my standard administrative dashboard loaded perfectly. My executive privileges were fully restored. I told Sarah to hold all of my calls, cancel my afternoon meetings, and bring me a fresh pot of black coffee. I locked the door behind her. I was officially going to war, and I needed absolute silence. I opened my forensic investigation software. This program was usually reserved for massive malpractice lawsuits or federal compliance audits, but today I was using it for a deeply personal manhunt. I typed the address of the $2.5 million Oak Brook estate into the primary search bar. The public tax records had already shown me the basic framework, but I needed the deep architectural blueprints of this financial scam. The property was registered to an anonymous holding company called Horizon Trust Management, LLC. That was exactly how wealthy criminals hid their assets from hospital billing departments. But I was not a standard billing clerk. I was a senior risk manager, heavily trained to hunt down ghost corporations and fraudulent shell companies. I opened a secondary secure window and logged into a premium legal database that tracks corporate filings across all 50 states. I entered the tax identification number for Horizon Trust Management. The system took almost a full minute to process the complex request. A loading bar filled slowly across the screen while I tapped my pen rhythmically against my wooden desk. When the secure document finally appeared, it revealed a massive web of shell companies designed entirely to confuse anyone looking for the true owner. I traced the money backwards step by painful step. Horizon Trust Management was owned by a secondary shell company based in Delaware. That Delaware company was funded by a private equity account, routing money through a regional bank in downtown Chicago. I pulled the banking registration details and bypassed the security firewall. There it was. The thick veil of corporate anonymity finally ripped wide open. The primary signatory on the master account was not Richard, and it was not Liam. It was a woman named Jada Vance. I stared at the name glowing brightly on my monitor. I quickly typed Jada Vance into our background check portal. The results flooded my screen instantly. Jada was 32 years old and lived right here in the city. Her professional profile was entirely public and highly polished. She was a senior corporate auditor at one of the top financial accounting firms in the state of Illinois. She had an impeccable credit score, a flawless professional record, and multiple advanced degrees in finance. She also had a marriage certificate filed exactly 4 years ago. Her legal husband was Liam. The golden child who had just threatened to destroy my career in the hospital hallway was married to a high-powered corporate auditor. The entire disgusting picture began to snap into perfect focus inside my mind. Richard and Liam were not just sloppy grifters trying to score a free hospital stay and steal a liver. They were operating a highly coordinated financial scheme with a professional auditor acting as their invisible shield. I pulled Jada's state tax filings and cross-referenced them directly with the property deed. It all made perfect, sickening sense. Jada used her flawless credit and massive corporate income to purchase the luxury estate under a hidden LLC. This kept the massive asset completely disconnected from Richard and Liam on paper. With the real estate wealth safely hidden behind Jada's corporate firewall, Richard could legally claim absolute poverty on any hospital intake form. He could drain public charity funds and demand federal emergency medical resources while sleeping in a 6-bedroom mansion every night. Jada was clearly the financial mastermind making the entire scam possible. She was the one who structured the shell companies. She was the one who signed the banking documents. She was the invisible architect of the very fraud that Liam was currently trying to use to blackmail me. A cold, furious anger settled deep into my bones, replacing the shock I had felt earlier. I hated Liam for his arrogant threats, and I hated Richard for leaving me in that shopping mall 30 years ago. But Jada Vance ignited a completely different kind of professional fury inside me. She was a woman who understood corporate compliance and medical law. She was a licensed auditor who knew exactly how much damage medical charity fraud caused to the healthcare system. She knew that every single dollar they stole from the hospital charity fund was a dollar stolen from a truly desperate patient. Yet she willingly used her brilliant mind to help them commit federal crimes. I printed every single document from my database: the tax filings, the LLC registrations, the marriage certificate, and the banking signatures. The heavy office printer hummed loudly, spitting out page after page of undeniable legal proof. I neatly arranged the papers into a thick manila folder. I was not just going to hand this file over to the hospital legal department. That would be far too easy. The legal team would simply file a quiet civil suit and handle it behind closed doors to avoid a massive public relations scandal. I needed this to be highly personal. I needed to look this woman directly in the eyes and watch her realize that her perfect criminal scheme had just been dismantled by the very woman her husband was trying to destroy. I pulled up Jada's corporate office address on my second monitor. Her accounting firm was located in a massive glass skyscraper right in the center of the downtown financial district. It was barely a 20-minute drive from the hospital. I looked at the digital clock on my computer screen. It was 1:30 in the afternoon. Liam was probably still celebrating his viral news video, assuming he had successfully ended my career. Richard was lying in Trauma Bay 4, waiting for his stolen liver. Jada was sitting comfortably in her expensive corporate office, believing she was completely untouchable. I picked up my office telephone and dialed human resources. I coldly informed the director that I was taking the rest of the afternoon off to conduct urgent field investigations regarding the active fraud case. She agreed immediately, too terrified of my newly established authority to ask any further questions. I grabbed a thick manila folder and shoved it into my leather briefcase. I put my dark gray blazer back on and checked my reflection in the small mirror hanging on the back of my door. My face was completely devoid of emotion. I looked exactly like a woman going to war. I walked out of my office and locked the heavy door behind me. I took the private executive elevator down to the underground parking garage. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of exhaust. I climbed into my car and threw the leather briefcase onto the passenger seat. As I drove out of the dark concrete garage and merged onto the busy Chicago highway, I mentally prepared my strategy for the afternoon. I knew exactly how corporate auditors thought and operated. They were deeply logical and immensely arrogant, relying entirely on their invisible paper trails to protect them from any real consequences. Jada assumed no one at a busy public hospital would ever dig deep enough to find her shell companies. She assumed I was just a low-level administrative casualty in her husband's grand master plan. She was about to find out that she picked the absolute wrong woman to victimize. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly as I navigated the downtown traffic. The afternoon streets were relatively clear, allowing me to push my car faster toward the towering financial district. I played out the upcoming confrontation in my head over and over again. I was not going to yell or scream. I was going to walk into her fortress of glass and steel and methodically dismantle her entire professional life piece by piece. I pulled up to the massive glass building and handed my car keys to the waiting valet. I grabbed my briefcase and walked aggressively through the heavy revolving doors into the expansive marble lobby. The digital corporate directory listed her elite accounting firm on the 42nd floor. I walked straight to the polished security desk and signed in under my real name, refusing to hide my identity. I stepped into the high-speed elevator and pressed the glowing button for her floor. The metal doors closed silently, sealing me inside the box. I was fully prepared to destroy Jada Vance and watch her perfectly structured world burn entirely to the ground. The unraveling thread had finally led me straight to the puppet master, and I was going to pull it until everything fell apart. The metal doors of the high-speed elevator slid open with a soft chime, revealing the 42nd floor. The reception area of the accounting firm was a massive expanse of polished white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the sprawling Chicago skyline. It was an environment perfectly designed to intimidate anyone who did not belong to the elite corporate class. The walls were adorned with expensive modern art, and the air smelled faintly of premium espresso and expensive leather. I walked out of the elevator, and my heels clicked sharply against the hard stone floor. I approached the massive curved reception desk, where a young woman in a tailored designer dress was typing quietly on a sleek computer. She looked up and gave me a practiced, hollow corporate smile. She asked how she could help me today. I placed both of my hands firmly on the cool marble counter and looked her directly in the eyes. I told her my name was Maya, and I was here to see Jada Vance immediately regarding an urgent legal compliance issue. The receptionist blinked, her smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. She asked if I had a scheduled appointment. I told her I did not need an appointment because the hospital risk management department does not operate on an accounting firm schedule. My tone was cold, authoritative, and completely unyielding. The receptionist swallowed nervously and picked up her desk phone, pressing a single button. She spoke in a hushed whisper, shielding her mouth with her hand. I stood perfectly still, adjusting the heavy strap of my leather briefcase. I knew exactly how these high-powered firms operated. They hated public scenes, and they despised unexpected legal threats in their pristine lobbies. Within 2 minutes, the heavy glass doors leading to the inner office suite swung open. A woman walked out, and the entire atmosphere of the room seemed to physically shift around her. This was Jada Vance. She was 32 years old and undeniably stunning. She was a tall African-American woman with flawless dark skin and a sharp bone structure that commanded immediate respect. She wore her thick, natural hair pulled back into a sleek, elegant bun that highlighted her striking features. Her outfit was a masterclass in corporate warfare. She wore a tailored emerald green suit that fit her perfectly, paired with minimalist gold jewelry that quietly screamed immense wealth. She carried a tablet in one hand and walked with the absolute confidence of a woman who was used to being the smartest person in any room she entered. She was Liam's wife. She was the architect of the invisible financial fortress protecting Richard. Jada stopped about 10 feet away from me. Her dark eyes swept over my dark gray hospital blazer and my leather briefcase, assessing me in less than a second. For a brief moment, her face remained completely neutral, projecting the polite mask of a senior auditor meeting an unexpected client. But then she actually looked at my face. She looked at my sharp jawline and the angle of my nose. I could physically see the exact moment the realization hit her. Liam must have shown her photographs of me. He must have spent the entire weekend feeding her a carefully constructed narrative about his terrifying past. The polite corporate mask instantly shattered. Her dark eyes widened slightly in pure shock before narrowing into a fierce protective glare. Her entire body tensed, and she took a protective step backward. Jada did not extend her hand to greet me. She did not introduce herself. She looked at me with absolute deep-seated disgust, and her voice was a sharp, controlled whisper designed to avoid alerting the receptionist. She told me I had exactly 10 seconds to turn around and get back into the elevator before she called building security to have me physically dragged out into the street. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. I told her I was not leaving this building until we had a very clear conversation about her husband and the $2.5 million estate currently shielding him from federal fraud charges. The mention of her husband did not shock her. It only made her infinitely more furious. She aggressively stepped directly into my personal space, completely invading it. Jada was taller than me, and she used every single inch of her height to try and intimidate me. She lowered her voice even further, venom dripping from every single word. She told me she knew exactly who I was. She said Liam had warned her about me. He told her all about his unhinged, estranged half-sister who had been stalking their family for years. She said Liam told her how deeply disturbed I was and how I was currently trying to leverage their dying father to extort money from them. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Liam had not just hidden his tracks. He had actively painted me as a mentally unstable criminal to his own wife. He weaponized my trauma and fed it to Jada as a warning. He made her believe I was a dangerous predator hunting down his innocent family. I listened to Jada repeat his disgusting lies, and a cold fire ignited in my chest. I looked directly into her furious dark eyes. I did not raise my voice, but I let the absolute weight of my authority bleed into my tone. I told Jada she was highly intelligent, but currently acting incredibly stupid. I asked her if she really believed a senior hospital risk manager would risk her entire professional career to stalk a pathetic man who abandoned her in a shopping mall 30 years ago. I asked her if she truly believed the heavily edited video Liam released to the news media this morning. Jada crossed her arms tightly over her emerald suit. She told me she did not care about my professional title or my pathetic excuses. She said she watched the video and she saw me deny her father-in-law life-saving medical care. She called me a heartless monster who was trying to punish an innocent family because of my own unresolved childhood trauma. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. She told me that if I ever came near her husband or her family, again, she would personally use every single lawyer in this massive building to bankrupt me and destroy my life. She threatened to file a permanent restraining order and have me arrested for corporate harassment. She was fiercely protective and utterly convinced that she was defending her family against a crazy stalker. Her absolute loyalty to Liam was both impressive and deeply pathetic because she had absolutely no idea she was the one being played. I did not back down. I stepped even closer until we were practically shoulder to shoulder in the massive empty lobby. The receptionist was nervously pretending to type, but she was clearly watching the silent war unfolding across the room. I told Jada she needed to stop acting like a loyal wife for 5 seconds and start acting like the senior corporate auditor she was paid to be. I told her to strip away the emotional garbage Liam fed her and look at the cold, hard facts. I told her that her precious husband and his dying father walked into my trauma center on Friday night and legally declared total financial destitution. I told her they formally applied for emergency hospital charity funds, specifically designated for the homeless. Jada scoffed and rolled her eyes. She said Richard was a retired mechanic who lived on a fixed income and had no savings. She said they were desperate. I cut her off immediately. My voice was sharp and slicing like a scalpel. I told her that was a fascinating story, but it was completely destroyed by the fact that Richard listed his primary emergency contact address as a luxury estate in Oak Brook worth $2.5 million. I watched Jada freeze. Her perfectly manicured hand dropped slightly from her chest. The fierce protective fire in her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a tiny spark of genuine confusion. I pressed the advantage aggressively. I told her that attempting to bypass the Federal Organ Registry waitlist while simultaneously defrauding a public hospital charity fund was a massive felony. I told her the State Medical Ethics Board and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were currently reviewing the intake files. I explained that when the federal agents trace that Oak Brook property, they are not going to find Liam or Richard on the deed. They are going to find a ghost holding company called Horizon Trust Management. Jada swallowed hard. The mention of the specific holding company name hit her like a physical blow. She tried to maintain her flawless aggressive posture, but I could see the tiny micro-expressions of panic bleeding through her corporate mask. She quickly glanced over her shoulder, checking to make sure the receptionist could not hear the specific financial details I was dropping. She turned back to me, and her voice was significantly less steady. She quietly demanded to know how I got that proprietary information. I told her I was a forensic risk manager who hunted down medical fraud for a living, and she was currently standing in the direct path of a federal indictment. I told her I knew the holding company was registered in Delaware. I told her I tracked the private equity funding straight through a regional bank in downtown Chicago. I told her I knew she was the primary signatory on the master account. Jada took a sharp breath. She told me I was completely insane. She fiercely denied having any involvement in Medicaid fraud. She said she purchased that property as a private real estate investment for her own portfolio and allowed her father-in-law to live there as a favor to her husband. She insisted it was completely legal to own property and it had absolutely nothing to do with Richard claiming poverty at a hospital. She tried to throw her corporate weight around, telling me that her private assets were entirely separate from her husband's medical emergencies. She accused me of illegally digging through her private financial records without a warrant and threatened to sue the hospital for a massive breach of privacy. She was fighting back with everything she had, using her immense knowledge of corporate law to try and build a wall between herself and the crime. I looked at her with pure clinical detachment. I let her finish her aggressive legal threats before I spoke again. I told her logic would be perfectly sound if Richard had not used her specific property as his emergency financial guarantor address while simultaneously claiming absolute poverty to steal public funds. I told her that action legally bridged the gap between her private asset and his federal fraud. I asked her point blank if she truly believed Liam was innocent in all of this. I asked her if she really thought a man who wore custom-tailored suits and $10,000 watches was completely oblivious to the fact that his father was committing felony intake fraud. Jada clenched her jaw so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. She defended Liam instantly. She said Liam was a successful entrepreneur who made his own money and cared deeply about his family. She said he would never orchestrate a fraud scheme, and he would certainly never involve her in something illegal without her knowledge. She looked at me with absolute burning hatred. She told me I was a bitter, lonely woman who was jealous of the loving family Liam had built. She said I was trying to tear them apart because I could not handle the fact that Richard chose them over me. The insult was designed to inflict maximum emotional pain, but it completely failed. It only proved to me exactly how deeply Liam had manipulated this brilliant woman. He had her completely brainwashed into believing he was the perfect husband while he was secretly using her flawless financial record as a human shield. Jada stepped back and pointed toward the glass elevators. She told me the conversation was over. She said if I had any evidence of fraud, I could send it directly to her legal team, but she was not going to stand in her own lobby and listen to a crazy stalker insult her husband. She turned her back to me, fully intending to walk away and return to her safe, pristine corporate bubble. She thought she had won the confrontation by shutting me down and hiding behind her wealth. She thought I was just throwing empty accusations into the air to scare her. She did not realize I had brought the entire bomb directly to her front door. I watched Jada turn her back on me. Her emerald green suit caught the expensive overhead lighting as she took her first step toward the secure glass doors. She fully expected me to shout or make a desperate scene in the middle of her pristine corporate lobby. She thought I was just another hysterical relative she could easily dismiss with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. I did not shout. I did not move toward the exit. Instead, I unclasped the heavy brass buckle of my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out the massive binder of financial documents I had printed back at my hospital office. The thick stack of paper was bound tightly in a heavy black plastic cover. I lifted the massive binder high into the air and slammed it down directly onto the polished white marble of the reception desk. The sound was incredibly loud. It cracked through the quiet, elegant lobby like a physical gunshot. The receptionist jumped out of her ergonomic chair with a soft gasp. Jada stopped dead in her tracks. Her shoulders stiffened instantly. She turned around slowly and the look of absolute murderous rage on her face was chilling. She walked back toward me, her heels striking the marble floor with aggressive, violent force. She looked at the heavy binder sitting on the counter and then glared directly into my eyes. She opened her mouth to order security to drag me out of the building. I did not give her the chance to speak a single syllable. I reached out and flipped open the heavy black cover of the binder. I told her that if she walked through those glass doors right now, she would be walking straight into federal prison, totally blind. I told her she needed to look down at the first page of the document before she made the biggest catastrophic mistake of her entire life. Jada glared at me, breathing heavily, but her eyes instinctively dropped to the paper. The first page was the master deed for the Oak Brook estate. It was the exact same document she had signed 4 years ago. I asked her to verbally confirm that she was the sole legal owner of the $2.5 million property and that she had purchased it using her own immaculate corporate credit. Jada looked at the document and crossed her arms tightly. She coldly informed me that the deed was perfectly legal and simply proved she was a smart real estate investor who let her husband live with his father in her property. She said there was absolutely nothing fraudulent about a wealthy woman owning a home. I nodded slowly, agreeing with her completely. I told her she was absolutely right. Owning a $2.5 million home was not a crime at all. Then I reached out and turned to the second page in the massive binder. I slid the thick stack of paper slightly closer to her across the cool marble counter. I told her that owning the home was not the crime, but what her husband did to the home absolutely was. The second page was a highly secure banking document I had pulled from the encrypted regional bank server. It was a formal legal contract for a massive secondary mortgage taken out against the Oak Brook estate. The loan amount was for a staggering $1.8 million. Jada stared at the number printed in bold black ink near the top of the page. The deep, furious anger in her dark eyes instantly vanished. Her flawless, confident corporate mask did not just slip, it completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her jaw physically dropped, and the blood completely drained from her beautiful face, leaving her looking entirely grey. She uncrossed her arms and placed both of her trembling hands flat on the marble counter, leaning in close to the paper as if her eyes were playing a cruel trick on her. She whispered that this was impossible. She said she owned the property outright and she had absolutely never authorized a second mortgage. She said she was a senior corporate auditor who audited bank loans for a living and she would never ever leverage a luxury estate for cash. I looked at her with pure clinical detachment. I told her I knew she did not take out the loan. I reached out and flipped to the third page of the binder. It was the final signature page of the $1.8 million loan agreement. There, right on the bottom line, was the name Jada Vance, signed in smooth-flowing blue ink. Next to it was the official red stamp of a licensed public notary. I watched Jada trace the signature with her perfectly manicured index finger. Her hand was shaking so violently she could barely keep it steady on the paper. I watched her brilliant analytical mind process the devastating reality of the forgery in real time. The signature looked incredibly close to hers, but as a professional auditor, she immediately spotted the subtle, terrifying differences. The loop on the letter J was slightly too wide. The sharp angle of the letter V was slightly too soft. It was a masterful forgery, but it was still a forgery. I told her that Liam had copied her signature perfectly enough to fool a regional bank manager who was probably eager to approve a massive loan for a wealthy corporate client. I told her Liam used her flawless credit score and her pristine professional reputation to secure nearly $2 million in liquid cash without her ever knowing a single thing about it. Jada could barely breathe. She looked up at me and her fierce defensive posture was entirely gone. She was no longer a wealthy auditor looking down on a hospital employee. She was a woman who had just realized she was standing on a live landmine built by the man she slept next to every single night. I explained that Liam did not just forge her signature on a whim. He must have carefully studied her handwriting for months. He must have waited for her to be completely distracted by massive corporate audits at work, so she would not notice the mail from the bank. I told her he probably intercepted the loan approval letters and the monthly statement notices before she even came home from the office. He engineered an entire secondary reality inside their own home. He smiled at her across the dinner table while simultaneously sinking her into millions of dollars of hidden debt. Jada gripped the edge of the marble counter so hard her knuckles turned completely white. She leaned her weight forward as if her legs could no longer support her. She whispered that the notary stamp was from a man named David who worked at a small private shipping store near their neighborhood. She realized out loud that Liam must have bribed the notary to authenticate the forged signature without her being physically present in the room. The meticulous, terrifying premeditation of her husband hit her with the force of a freight train. She was an expert at finding hidden money in massive multinational corporations, but she had completely missed the massive theft happening right inside her own marriage. She frantically asked me where the money went. She asked if Liam had used the $1.8 million to pay for his father and his expensive medical treatments. I let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed in the quiet lobby. I told her Richard was currently lying in my emergency room claiming absolute poverty so he could steal a free liver from the hospital charity fund. They were definitely not using their own stolen money to pay for medical care. I turned to the fourth page in the massive binder. This page contained the highly complex routing numbers and international wire transfers I had spent the last 2 hours tracking down. I pointed my finger at the long columns of outgoing transactions. I explained that Liam was not the highly successful, legitimate entrepreneur he pretended to be. I told her to look closely at the destination accounts for the $1.8 million. The money did not go into a joint savings account. It did not go toward any medical bills. The massive sums of cash were wired directly in rapid succession to a series of offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands and Macau. I explained that those specific accounts belonged to high-stakes international gambling syndicates. Liam was a catastrophic, degenerate gambler. He had completely drained the massive second mortgage to cover his massive illegal gambling debts and place even larger bets overseas. I told her Liam had taken out the massive loan entirely in her name, leaving her solely and completely legally liable for every single penny of the $1.8 million debt, while he lost all the cash at the tables. Jada stared at the wire transfers in absolute horrifying silence. I could literally see the massive heavy weight of the financial ruin crushing her small frame. As a senior auditor, she knew exactly what this meant. She knew that when the bank eventually called in that massive loan, she would be entirely responsible. The bank would seize the $2.5 million estate immediately. They would garnish her massive corporate salary. The State Accounting Board would instantly strip her of her professional auditing licenses for being involved in massive undetected financial fraud. Her entire perfect life, her pristine career, her immense wealth, and her flawless reputation would be completely destroyed. And Liam had set the entire thing up. He had used her as a human cash machine to fund his secret double life. While Richard played the helpless dying father to gain sympathy and steal public charity funds, Liam was actively robbing his own wife blind behind her back. I stood perfectly still and watched her process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I told her that the fraud did not stop with the gambling debts. I explained that by claiming total poverty at the hospital while his son sat on millions in stolen cash, Richard and Liam were officially committing federal Medicaid fraud. I told her that when the federal agents finally arrived to investigate the hospital intake forms, they would follow the money trail straight to this exact binder. They would look at the forged signatures and the offshore wires. They would not see Jada as a victim. They would see a senior corporate auditor who mysteriously owned a hidden estate and sent millions to the Cayman Islands. I told her the federal government would assume she was the criminal mastermind laundering money for her husband. Liam had not just stolen her money, he had perfectly framed her for massive federal crimes. Jada closed her eyes and let out a broken, trembling breath. When she opened her eyes again, they were completely different. The fierce loyalty to her husband was entirely dead. The defensive anger she had directed at me was gone. All that remained in her dark eyes was a terrifying, ice-cold realization. I placed my hand flat on top of the open binder. I told Jada that Liam came into my hospital today and threatened to destroy my career because I refused to let his father steal an organ. I told her Liam thought he could use my trauma to manipulate me and use her credit to fund his addiction. I looked directly into Jada, and I asked her what she wanted to do now. Jada stared at me for a long, heavy moment. Then she turned away from the marble reception desk and walked briskly toward the heavy glass doors leading to her private office suite. She did not ask me to follow her, but she left the door wide open. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase and walked inside. Her private office was an expansive corner suite with massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray Chicago skyline. It was immaculate and intimidating. Jada walked straight to her massive mahogany desk and dropped her tablet. She sat down in her leather chair and practically attacked her computer keyboard. She bypassed her standard work portal and logged directly into her encrypted personal financial monitoring software. This was the high-tier security system she used to manage her massive corporate salary and private investments. I stood quietly near the doorway, watching the blue light from the massive monitors reflect across her face. The room was absolutely silent except for the rapid, aggressive clicking of her fingernails against the keyboard. She was running a comprehensive deep dive credit sweep across all 3 major bureaus. As a senior auditor, she had access to institutional-level data. It took less than 2 minutes for the system to aggregate her entire financial footprint. When the final report loaded onto the screen, Jada completely stopped typing. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. She stared at the monitor, and I could see her chest rising and falling in shallow, terrified breaths. The $1.8 million secondary mortgage was sitting right there in bright red pixels. It was officially registered under her Social Security number, attached perfectly to the Oak Brook estate. She clicked another button tracing the banking history attached to the forged loan. She saw the massive outgoing wire transfers to Macau and the Cayman Islands perfectly matching the documents I had brought her. She saw the monthly minimum payments being secretly routed from a hidden shell account Liam had set up to keep the loan from defaulting and triggering an automatic alert. Liam had perfectly constructed a financial parasite feeding off her pristine credit. Jada buried her face in her hands. She did not cry. She just let out a long, trembling exhale that sounded like a balloon slowly losing all its air. I walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug and took a seat in one of the leather guest chairs opposite her desk. I did not offer her a tissue, and I did not offer her any hollow words of comfort. We were both highly analytical women who operated in the cold, hard reality of facts and liabilities. I knew she did not want pity. She wanted absolute clarity. Jada lowered her hands and looked at me. Her dark eyes were completely hollowed out. She spoke in a quiet, raspy whisper. She told me that she met Liam 5 years ago at a charity gala. He was charming and attentive, and he told her he was a highly successful private equity manager. She said he always insisted on keeping their finances strictly separate, claiming he wanted to respect her independence as a powerful corporate woman. She realized right now that keeping their money separate was just his calculated way of ensuring she never looked at his actual bank accounts. He had no private equity firm. He had absolutely nothing. He targeted her specifically because she was a brilliant, high-earning auditor with a flawless financial background. He married her purely to acquire a human financial shield for his massive offshore gambling addiction. I leaned forward in my chair, resting my arms on my knees. I looked directly into her eyes and told her I understood exactly how she felt. I told her that for my entire life I thought my father abandoned me because I was fundamentally unlovable. I thought I was a broken, defective child who was not worth the effort of raising. But today I realized the cold, hard truth. Richard did not leave me because I was a bad child. He left me because he was a selfish coward, and now he only wanted me back because his liver was failing and I was a perfect genetic match. I explained to Jada that Richard and Liam were exactly the same kind of monster. They did not view women as human beings. They viewed us entirely as disposable resources. Liam looked at Jada and saw an infinite bank account and a pristine credit score. Richard looked at me and saw a biological spare parts bin perfectly matched to save his miserable life. We were not family to them. We were just their supply chain. Jada listened to my words, and the hollow, devastating look in her eyes slowly began to morph into something else entirely. The pure, blinding shock of the betrayal was burning away rapidly, leaving behind a massive, concentrated core of absolute white-hot rage. She sat up perfectly straight in her heavy leather chair and smoothed the lapels of her emerald green suit. Her flawless, polite corporate mask did not return, but something much more dangerous took its place. She was a senior corporate auditor who had just discovered a massive rat chewing through her own house, and she was going to exterminate it. Jada turned her eyes back to the glowing computer monitors. She asked me in a cold, mechanical voice what my exact plan was. I told her the hospital board was currently terrified of a massive public relations disaster because Liam had leaked a highly edited video of me refusing to treat Richard. I explained that Liam was trying to use the angry media mob to force my hand so I would bypass the federal organ waitlist and approve the massive charity funds. Jada nodded slowly, her brilliant analytical mind already calculating the complex legal angles. She pointed out that if Richard received that liver using the hospital charity funds, the federal government would automatically audit his financial background to verify his absolute poverty status. The federal agents would instantly find the Oak Brook luxury estate. They would find the hidden holding company. They would find her forged signature on the mortgage documents. I confirmed her exact terrifying fears. I told her that Liam was so incredibly desperate to save his father and keep his inheritance secure that he was willing to throw her directly in front of a federal indictment to save himself. Jada typed a few rapid commands into her keyboard. She brought up a highly secure corporate legal portal. She told me she was not going to sit around and wait for the federal agents to come knocking on her front door. She said she was going to burn Liam entirely to the ground before he even realized she had struck a match. We sat in that high-rise corner office and began to forge a ruthless, silent alliance. There was no formal handshake, and there were no emotional declarations of newfound friendship. We were simply two incredibly powerful professional women who had been pushed to the absolute edge by the exact same pathetic men. We spoke the exact same language of corporate destruction and liability management. Jada told me her first move was to immediately freeze every single asset attached to her name. She said she was going to lock the holding company accounts and file an emergency identity theft report with the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding the forged mortgage documents. She was going to legally sever herself from Liam's financial parasite, completely trapping him under the massive crushing weight of the $1.8 million debt. I told her that was the perfect first strike, but we needed to coordinate our attacks flawlessly to ensure neither Liam nor Richard had any possible room to escape. I explained to Jada that freezing the banking accounts would trigger an automatic digital notification to Liam's cell phone. He would instantly know she had discovered the massive fraud. Jada shook her head and typed another complex command into her terminal. She told me she could institute a high-level shadow freeze. It was a restricted auditing tactic where the accounts remained visually open on the consumer end, but all outgoing transactions and wire transfers were completely hard-locked by the bank security division. Liam would still see the fake positive balances on his mobile banking application, but the exact second he tried to move a single dollar, the banking system would automatically deny the request and flag his location. This would give us the critical element of total surprise. I smiled a cold, hard smile. It was a truly brilliant tactical maneuver. I told Jada my side of the execution plan. I explained that Liam had scheduled an emergency family meeting in Richard's private hospital suite for tomorrow morning. Liam was planning to bring a sleazy private attorney to threaten me with a massive civil lawsuit if I did not immediately sign the federal organ bypass paperwork and approve the hospital charity funds. Liam actually thought he was trapping me in a corner. I told Jada we were going to let him believe he was winning right up until the very last possible second. I instructed Jada to meticulously gather every single piece of financial evidence we had discussed. The forged mortgage documents, the offshore wire transfers, the holding company registration, and her shadow freeze confirmation codes. I told her I would personally bring the hospital chief legal counsel and 2 federal compliance investigators directly to the hospital room. We were going to physically trap them inside the intensive care unit. Jada looked at me, her dark eyes burning with a fierce, calculating intensity. She asked me if I was absolutely sure I wanted to do this. She reminded me that Richard was still technically my biological father, and once we handed this massive stack of evidence over to the federal authorities, there would be absolutely no turning back. Richard would be permanently and entirely disqualified from the National Transplant Registry due to chronic documented medical fraud. He would be completely removed from the hospital charity program and kicked out onto the street. Without the liver, he would likely not survive the month. I did not blink, and I did not look away from her. I told Jada that Richard made his final choice 30 years ago, when he left a terrified 5-year-old girl entirely alone in a massive shopping mall just to save himself. I told her he made his choice again today when he decided to use my hard-earned career to steal an organ while his golden son robbed her blind. I told her I felt absolutely nothing for the sick man bleeding on that hospital bed. I was entirely, completely empty of any daughterly obligation or guilt. Jada leaned back in her heavy leather chair and steepled her fingers together. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the Chicago skyline, casting long dark shadows across her massive corner office. The lighting perfectly matched the incredibly dark nature of the conversation we were having. She told me that for the last 4 years, she had constantly felt like something was slightly wrong in her perfect marriage. She said Liam was always perfectly loving and attentive, but there was always a strange, hollow feeling behind his dark eyes. She said she actively ignored her own intuition because she wanted the perfect, successful life. She wanted the handsome, wealthy husband and the beautiful luxury home to match her massive corporate success. She confessed that she had unknowingly funded his entire fake lifestyle, paying for his expensive tailored suits, his luxury car, and his expensive dinners, because he always claimed his private equity funds were tied up in long-term offshore investments. She had been blindly financing her own complete financial destruction. I listened to her confess the deep, humiliating reality of being manipulated by a sociopath. I told her she had absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. I explained that sociopaths, like Liam and Richard, do not target weak or stupid women. They specifically target incredibly strong, intelligent, and highly capable women because we provide the highest possible yield for their parasitic behavior. They target women who are used to carrying the heavy burdens of the world so they can secretly load their own massive failures onto our backs without us noticing. Jada absorbed my words, and a quiet, profound understanding passed between us in the silent room. We were two completely different women from two completely different worlds, but in this exact moment, we were perfectly aligned. We were both standing at the edge of a massive, dangerous cliff, and instead of letting these men push us over, we were going to turn around and throw them directly into the dark abyss. Jada reached across her polished mahogany desk and pulled a thick, crisp piece of premium corporate stationery from her top drawer. She picked up a heavy gold fountain pen and began to rapidly write down a precise military-style timeline of events. She was officially shifting from a betrayed, heartbroken wife into a senior corporate auditor executing a hostile and highly lethal takeover. She listed the exact times she would file the federal identity theft reports with the authorities. She noted the specific banking executives she needed to contact directly to initiate the shadow freeze on the $1.8 million fraudulent loan. She drafted a quick, comprehensive outline for the emergency divorce filings she would submit to the county courthouse first thing in the morning. She was moving with a terrifying, ruthless efficiency that was beautiful to watch. I watched her work and felt a deep surge of profound professional respect. Liam had absolutely no idea what kind of absolute monster he had just woken up. He actually thought he was playing a simple game of emotional manipulation, but he had accidentally triggered a catastrophic legal avalanche that was going to bury him alive. I pulled out my own hospital administrative tablet and began syncing my actions perfectly with her timeline. I told her I would officially flag Richard's medical file for a severe priority compliance review, effectively freezing his charity application in an endless loop of bureaucratic purgatory. I would then contact my most trusted federal compliance investigator and arrange for them to be present at the hospital tomorrow morning under the guise of a routine standard intake audit. Liam would simply assume the investigator was there to pressure me into approving the organ bypass due to the media scandal. He would never suspect the investigator was actually there to arrest him on the spot for massive wire fraud and identity theft. We spent the next 2 hours in her office meticulously stress-testing every single aspect of our complex plan. We actively looked for any possible legal loopholes Liam might try to exploit in court. We anticipated his predictable lies and formulated our counter-arguments with absolute surgical precision. We built an inescapable iron cage constructed entirely out of strict federal law and undeniable financial documentation. By the time the city streetlights began to flicker on outside her massive window, our alliance was forged completely in iron and fire. We were perfectly ready for war. Jada stood up from her desk and walked over to a small, elegant bar cart sitting near the corner of her office. She poured 2 small glasses of extremely expensive dark amber whiskey. She walked back over and handed one of the heavy crystal glasses directly to me. She raised her glass slightly, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute, unwavering, lethal determination. She did not propose a soft toast to friendship or family. She simply looked at me and stated that tomorrow morning we were going to take back exactly what belonged to us, and we were going to leave them with absolutely nothing. I raised my glass and tapped it lightly against hers. The sharp crystalline clink echoed loudly in the quiet corporate office. I took a slow-burning sip of the expensive whiskey and told her I was deeply looking forward to watching them burn. Jada gave a single sharp nod. The terrified, betrayed wife was completely gone forever. The brilliant, ruthless auditor was fully in command and ready to execute. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase and walked out of her massive corner office, leaving Jada standing tall and completely unbroken against the dark city skyline. Conflict 3 was over. The trap was perfectly set, and the hunt had officially begun. Tuesday morning arrived with a sharp chill, but inside my risk management office, the atmosphere was electric. I sat at my heavy desk with my hot coffee and pulled up the live security camera feed for the main hospital lobby on my left monitor. Jada had initiated the banking shadow freeze precisely at midnight. Now I just had to wait for the exact moment Liam tried to use his stolen wealth. At 9:15 in the morning, the trap finally snapped shut. Liam strutted up to the concierge billing desk wearing another expensive tailored suit. He looked incredibly smug, fully believing he still held all the power over my career. He pulled out a sleek metal credit card to pay for a private luxury recovery suite he was trying to reserve for his dying father. The hospital billing clerk politely took the card and swiped it through the machine. The machine beeped a harsh red denial. Liam frowned and aggressively snatched the card back. He pulled out a second premium card and slammed it on the marble counter. The clerk swiped it again. Another instant harsh denial. I watched closely as the arrogant golden child began to physically unravel right in front of the high-definition security camera. His face turned a deep, blotchy red. He pulled out his expensive cell phone and frantically opened his mobile banking application. He could see the massive fraudulent balance sitting right there on his screen, but the shadow freeze meant his stolen money was nothing more than a digital ghost. He tapped the screen aggressively, trying to initiate an emergency wire transfer. The bank security system instantly denied the request. He slammed his fist down hard on the billing counter, startling the innocent clerk. He was completely cut off from his offshore gambling accounts and his stolen secondary mortgage cash. He had absolutely nothing. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my coffee. But Liam was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are incredibly dangerous. He realized instantly that if he could not buy his way into a private surgery suite, he had to force the hospital to act using legal brute force. He stormed away from the billing desk and marched directly toward the intensive care administration wing. I quickly switched my computer monitor to the digital intake dashboard. I watched his name pop up in the active queue. Liam was moving with pure reckless desperation. He demanded a blank medical power of attorney document from the floor nurse. He aggressively filled out the paperwork, officially declaring himself the sole legal medical proxy for our father. This document gave him the absolute legal authority to demand specific medical treatments and override standard hospital wait times. But a power of attorney is completely useless without a massive financial guarantor to back up the astronomical medical bills. Liam reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white plastic card. He handed it to the intake nurse. I refreshed my digital dashboard, and the scanned image of the card appeared directly on my screen. My stomach dropped completely. It was not Richard's standard public aid card. It was a platinum corporate health insurance policy. I zoomed in on the scanned, high-resolution image. The name printed in bold black letters across the bottom of the plastic card was Jada Vance. Liam had actually stolen his wife's physical insurance card from her wallet before he left their luxury estate this morning. He was taking his massive criminal fraud to an entirely new and catastrophic level. He rapidly filled out the federal dependent forms, claiming that Richard was a permanent, legal dependent residing in Jada's household. He was deliberately attempting to attach a dying man to a premium corporate insurance policy that featured an unlimited catastrophic coverage clause. If this medical power of attorney and insurance claim were officially processed by the hospital billing department, Richard would immediately be reclassified from a public charity case to a top-tier premium VIP patient. The hospital algorithm would automatically bypass the charity waitlist and prioritize him for the urgent organ transplant, because the massive surgical bills would be entirely guaranteed by Jada's accounting firm. Liam was trying to use Jada's brilliant career to literally buy his father a new liver. I picked up my secure office telephone and dialed Jada's direct private line. She answered on the very first ring. I did not waste time with polite greetings. I told her Liam was currently standing at the intensive care desk, submitting her platinum corporate policy to secure a medical power of attorney. I heard Jada suck in a sharp breath. Her voice turned to absolute ice. She quickly checked her designer purse and confirmed that her physical insurance card was completely missing. I explained the terrifying reality of the situation. I told her that if the hospital formally accepted the forged dependency forms, her accounting firm would immediately be billed for hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency surgical fees. The corporate human resources department would instantly flag the massive claim for an internal fraud audit. They would discover that Jada was seemingly harboring a fraudulent dependent, and they would terminate her prestigious employment for gross ethical violations before the week was over. Liam was completely willing to destroy her entire professional life just to win his sick, twisted game and save his inheritance. Jada did not panic. the brilliant corporate auditor inside her took complete control of the situation. She told me we could not just cancel the policy through the hospital computer system. She explained that because Liam had already signed the medical power of attorney, under the legal guise of being her lawful husband, standard hospital administrative blocks would not be strong enough to stop the automated billing algorithms. We needed a heavy, ironclad legal weapon. We needed a federal judge. Jada told me to print every single piece of the fraudulent intake paperwork immediately. She said she was leaving her downtown office right this very second, and she told me to meet her directly at the Daily Center courthouse in exactly 20 minutes. I hung up the phone and printed the forged dependency forms and the scanned corporate insurance card. I grabbed my heavy leather briefcase and sprinted out of my office. I bypassed the main slow elevators and ran down the concrete stairwell to the underground parking garage. My heart was pounding a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. We were officially racing against the massive hospital bureaucracy. The hospital billing department processes all new intake forms at exactly 4 in the afternoon. If we did not have a judge sign an emergency legal injunction before that exact deadline, Liam's fraudulent paperwork would be permanently locked into the federal system, and the financial damage to Jada would be completely irreversible. I threw my car into drive and sped out of the dark garage, merging aggressively into the heavy downtown Chicago traffic. The drive was agonizing. Every single red light felt like a massive catastrophic failure. I pulled up to the massive, brutalist architecture of the downtown courthouse and left my car with the valet. I ran up the wide concrete steps and pushed through the heavy revolving doors. Jada was already standing by the metal detectors, looking like an absolute force of nature in a sharp black tailored suit. She held a thick manila folder completely packed with her own emergency legal filings. We locked eyes and gave each other a single determined nod. There was absolutely no time for conversation. We moved through the crowded security checkpoint and practically sprinted toward the county clerk's office on the 4th floor. The clerk's office was a chaotic sea of frustrated lawyers and angry citizens. We pushed our way straight to the front of the line, completely ignoring the angry shouts from the people standing behind us. Jada slammed her thick manila folder down on the clerk's wooden desk. I slammed my heavy hospital binder right next to it. Jada looked the terrified clerk directly in the eyes and demanded an immediate emergency hearing with the duty judge for a catastrophic medical fraud injunction. The clerk tried to tell us we needed to take a numbered ticket and wait our turn. I pulled out my senior hospital risk management badge and held it directly in front of the clerk's face. I told him we were actively stopping a multi-million-dollar federal medical fraud currently in progress at a level 1 trauma center, and if he did not get a judge out here in exactly 2 minutes, I would personally hold the county legally liable for the damages. The clerk swallowed hard, picked up his heavy desk phone, and started dialing frantically. 5 minutes later, we were standing inside a small private judicial chamber. The duty judge was an older woman with sharp, perceptive eyes. She looked incredibly annoyed at the sudden interruption, but as Jada and I methodically laid out the massive paper trail of forged signatures, stolen insurance cards, and illegal medical power of attorney documents, her annoyance completely vanished. She realized exactly how dangerous Liam was. Jada stood, incredibly tall, and formally requested a temporary restraining order, completely blocking Liam from using her financial or medical assets and legally nullifying his medical power of attorney due to gross criminal fraud. We watched the large round clock on the chamber wall ticking relentlessly toward the 4:00 deadline. At exactly 3:45, the judge picked up her heavy black pen. She pressed the pen firmly against the crisp white paper. The sound of the ink scratching across the signature line was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. She stamped the document with the official heavy red seal of the county court. She handed the original copies directly back to Jada and told us the injunction was effective immediately across all state and federal medical databases. We walked out of the judicial chambers and the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind us. We stood in the quiet marble hallway of the courthouse. The massive crushing weight of the afternoon deadline finally lifted off my shoulders. I pulled out my cell phone and immediately scanned the signed legal injunction into the hospital administrative portal directly from the hallway. I attached the judge's strict order to Liam's medical power of attorney request and permanently deleted his fraudulent insurance claim from the hospital system. Liam thought he was a brilliant mastermind, manipulating the medical system to save his father. He had absolutely no idea that two powerful women had just legally amputated his entire strategy. Jada looked down at the court documents in her hands and let out a long breath. We had won the race, but the true war was scheduled for tomorrow morning in the intensive care unit. We turned around and walked out of the courthouse together, ready to bring the entire hospital down on his head. I walked back into my risk management office, holding the certified court injunction in my right hand. The victory at the courthouse was significant, but I knew Liam was desperate and wealthy enough to hire aggressive lawyers who might try to challenge the judge tomorrow morning. I needed to build a secondary defensive wall so thick that even an army of corporate attorneys could not break through it. I sat down at my desk and opened the deepest level of the hospital medical archives. My goal was simple. I wanted to find a long-documented history of Richard hiding his chronic liver condition. If I could prove he had a pre-existing condition that he deliberately lied about on his initial intake forms, I could trigger an automatic, permanent denial from any insurance provider, including the state Medicaid program. I typed his full legal name and his date of birth into the master search bar and hit enter. The hospital database holds digital records dating back over 40 years. It pulls information from a massive statewide medical information exchange, tracking every single hospital visit, surgery, and prescription a patient has ever received within the state of Illinois. The screen populated with hundreds of individual files. I started at the top, reading through his most recent visits, and slowly worked my way backward through time. I read through his routine checkups in 2015. I scrolled past a minor surgical procedure in 2008. I moved methodically, reading the cold clinical notes written by dozens of different doctors. I was completely detached, simply looking for anomalies in his blood work or hidden liver enzyme spikes. But as I continued scrolling backward down the long digital page, the years began to inch closer to a very specific and highly traumatic point in my own personal history. The dates on the screen shifted from the early 2000s into the late 1990s. My hand hesitated over the computer mouse. 1996, that was the year. That was the exact year my mother worked double shifts at a local diner just to keep our apartment warm. That was the year Richard took me to the massive Sears department store, told me to wait by a rack of heavy winter coats, and walked out the glass doors forever. For 30 years, I believed he left because the financial pressure of raising a 5-year-old child was simply too much for him. I believed he was just a cowardly man who wanted to escape the heavy responsibilities of fatherhood. I took a deep breath and clicked on his medical file for 1996. I expected to see maybe a standard physical exam or a minor urgent care visit. Instead, the screen took an unusually long time to load. When the document finally rendered on my monitor, it was not a single page. It was a massive 60-page comprehensive medical dossier from a highly specialized research hospital located in downtown Chicago. I leaned close to the glowing monitor. I read the primary diagnosis code printed at the top of the first page. In the spring of 1996, Richard was diagnosed with a highly aggressive and incredibly rare autoimmune disease that was rapidly destroying his internal organs. The clinical notes described him as being in critical condition, requiring an immediate and highly experimental biological therapy to survive. I scrolled rapidly through the pages of complex medical jargon until I reached the final financial billing summary. I looked at the total cost of the experimental treatment. The number printed on the old scanned document was staggering. The hospital had billed a total of $200,000 for his care. In 1996, $200,000 was an absolute fortune. It was the kind of massive, crushing medical debt that destroys entire families overnight. But Richard did not declare bankruptcy, and he did not die. He received a full life-saving experimental treatment and walked out of the hospital completely cured. My forensic training kicked in instantly, overriding the sudden heavy pounding in my chest. A man working a minimum wage construction job in 1996 does not simply produce $200,000 in cash. I needed to know exactly how that massive medical bill was paid. I zoomed in on the scanned financial guarantor section at the very bottom of the billing summary. The document showed that Richard did not have any primary medical insurance at the time. Instead, the entire $200,000 experimental procedure was miraculously covered in full by a highly obscure federal grant specifically designed to provide catastrophic medical funding for critically ill minor children. I stared at the words printed on the screen, critically ill minor children. It made absolutely no logical sense. Richard was 36 years old when he received that treatment. He was an adult male. I pulled my keyboard closer and initiated a secondary forensic search using the exact billing authorization code printed on the old document. I bypassed the standard medical viewer and accessed the raw unencrypted billing data from the state financial archives. The raw data appeared on my screen in a long string of green text. I scanned across the line of data, looking for the primary social security number that was used to legally secure the massive federal grant. I found the 9-digit number listed under the primary applicant field. I read the first 3 numbers. Then I read the next 2. Then I read the final 4. My entire body went completely cold. It felt as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of my locked office. The social security number listed on the massive fraudulent grant application was my own. I sat frozen in my leather chair staring at the 9 digits glowing on the monitor. The terrifying reality of what I was looking at slowly began to piece itself together in my mind, like a horrific jigsaw puzzle. In 1996, Richard was dying. He needed an incredibly expensive experimental treatment to survive, but he had absolutely no money and no insurance. So he committed massive identity theft against his own 5-year-old daughter. He used my name, my date of birth, and my social security number to fraudulently apply for a massive federal pediatric medical grant. He legally documented that I was the one dying of the rare autoimmune disease. He falsified pediatric medical records and forged physician signatures to secure the $200,000. He routed the federal money directly to the research hospital to pay for his own adult experimental treatments, completely destroying my financial identity before I even learned how to read. But the catastrophic fraud did not stop there. I kept reading the fine print of the raw billing data. The federal grant required a long-term financial liability contract. Because the massive sum of money was issued under my social security number, the federal government legally attached a massive permanent tax lien to my identity to recover the administrative costs of the experimental program over time. Richard had legally chained a massive crushing debt entirely around my neck. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He did not leave me at that shopping mall because he was stressed or overwhelmed by fatherhood. He left me at that mall to completely sever all physical and legal ties with me before the massive federal fraud was ever discovered. He knew that if he stayed, my mother would eventually apply for a credit card or a bank loan, and the massive federal tax lien attached to my social security number would instantly trigger a massive federal investigation. She would discover the $200,000 pediatric medical grant, and she would realize he had stolen my identity. He abandoned me specifically to ensure that the massive financial crime he committed against me remained completely hidden forever. He threw me away at Sears like a piece of garbage so he could walk away completely clean and start a brand new wealthy life without any legal consequences. He sacrificed my entire future to save his own life, and then he simply erased me. I pushed my chair back from the desk. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press them flat against the hard wooden surface of my desk to force them to stop. The tears did not come. There was absolutely no sadness left inside me. The abandoned little girl waiting by the winter coats was completely gone. In her place was an executive risk manager holding the exact documentation required to send a man to federal prison for the rest of his miserable life. Richard was currently lying in my intensive care unit, desperately hoping I would save him again. He actually thought I was just an angry daughter who felt neglected. He had absolutely no idea that I had just uncovered the massive federal crime he committed 30 years ago. I turned my attention to a separate window open on my secondary monitor. It was Richard's current medical chart, specifically the cross-match blood panels run by the trauma doctors on Friday night. I scrolled down to the familial donor compatibility section. I read the results, and a dark, bitter laugh escaped my throat. The computer algorithm had automatically tested Liam's blood against his father's failing liver. The results were explicitly clear. Liam was a perfect biological match. He was young, healthy, and a 100% compatible donor. He could literally walk into an operating room right now, donate a lobe of his liver, and save his father's life with absolutely no need to bypass the federal organ waitlist. But he refused. Liam was fully aware he was a match, but he refused to undergo the painful surgery himself. That was the real reason he was hunting me down. Liam wanted to preserve his own perfect physical body while forcing the discarded, abandoned daughter to be carved open on an operating table in his place. They were both complete and utter monsters, hiding behind the mask of a loving family. I highlighted the raw 1996 billing data, the forged grant application, and the active liver donor compatibility report. I hit the print command. The heavy office printer hummed loudly as it produced the final pieces of undeniable evidence required to completely obliterate their entire existence. I neatly stacked the pages and placed them securely inside my heavy leather briefcase alongside the documents Jada had given me. Tomorrow morning in that intensive care unit, they were going to learn exactly what happens when you try to sacrifice the same woman twice. I sat in the absolute silence of my office, staring at the glowing computer screen. The raw billing data from 1996 was still illuminating the dark room, casting a harsh white light across my face. I had just uncovered a truth so fundamentally repulsive, it defied every single logical boundary of human nature. For 30 years, I had tortured myself with the belief that my father left me at that shopping mall because I was a difficult child. I believed I had somehow driven him away with my endless needs or my loud voice. I spent my entire childhood trying to be absolutely perfect, hoping that if I achieved enough success, he might somehow hear about it and decide I was finally worthy of his love. But the 9-digit social security number printed on the fraudulent medical grant application told a completely different and far more sinister story. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the digital lines of text with my index finger. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of his horrific crime. In the spring of 1996, Richard was diagnosed with a catastrophic autoimmune disease. The experimental biological treatments he required to survive cost exactly $200,000. He was a low-income construction worker with absolutely no health insurance, no savings, and no wealthy relatives to borrow from. So he looked at his 5-year-old daughter, and he did not see a child to protect. He saw a pristine, untouched financial identity waiting to be exploited. He stole my social security number and falsified a massive pediatric medical dossier. He officially declared to the federal government that I was the one dying of the rare disease. He forged physician signatures and routed the massive federal pediatric grant directly to his own adult treatment center. He stole my identity to save his own life, and in the process, he anchored a massive permanent federal tax lien directly to my name before I even entered the first grade. The realization of why he actually left me at the Sears department store hit me with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. It was never about the stress of fatherhood. It was a cold, calculated, and highly premeditated escape plan. He knew that the massive federal debt attached to my social security number was a ticking time bomb. He knew that the very second my mother tried to open a small savings account for me or apply for a minor bank loan, the federal authorities would instantly flag the account. They would discover the massive $200,000 pediatric medical grant, and the horrific identity theft would be completely exposed. Richard knew he would face decades in federal prison for defrauding a government medical program, so he engineered the perfect disappearing act. He took me to the crowded mall, told me to stand perfectly still by a rack of heavy winter coats, and he walked away forever. He abandoned me, specifically to sever all legal and physical ties with our family. He threw me away like a piece of hazardous waste, so my mother would be too consumed by the trauma of a missing father to ever look deeply into our financial records. I remembered how my mother worked triple shifts at a local diner just to keep our tiny apartment warm, completely unaware that the man she wept for had secretly buried her daughter under a mountain of federal debt. He traded my entire future, my safety, and my childhood simply to cover up his massive financial crime and start a brand new life. He built his perfect new family with Liam entirely on the ashes of my stolen identity. The sheer magnitude of his psychopathy was breathtaking. I was not a discarded daughter. I was the scapegoat for a massive federal felony. I pushed my chair back from the heavy wooden desk and took a long, deep breath. The terrified little girl who had cried herself to sleep for decades was completely gone. In her place was a senior hospital executive holding the exact forensic evidence required to completely obliterate the man who destroyed her life. But my analytical mind was not finished. The pieces of the puzzle regarding his past were perfectly assembled, but I needed to understand the exact mechanics of his present strategy. Why did he specifically come to my trauma center on Friday night? Why did Liam drag him into my emergency room and demand I use my administrative power to bypass the National Organ Registry? I minimized the 1996 billing archives and opened Richard's current intensive care medical chart. I navigated directly to the comprehensive hematology reports and the surgical crossmatch panels the trauma team had run when he was first admitted. A patient requiring an emergency liver transplant must undergo extensive genetic and biological compatibility testing to find a viable living donor. I scrolled past Richard's failing liver enzyme counts and opened the familial compatibility matrix. The hospital algorithm automatically tests the blood of any immediate family members present during admission to determine if a direct biological donation is possible. I looked at the genetic markers listed on the glowing screen, and a sharp, bitter laugh escaped my throat, echoing loudly in the empty office. The digital report was absolutely crystal clear. Liam had submitted his blood for testing the moment they arrived at the hospital. The crossmatch algorithm showed that Liam was a 100% perfect biological match for his father. He had the exact same rare blood type and the perfect genetic tissue markers required for a highly successful partial liver transplant. Liam was young. He was in peak physical condition, and his liver was incredibly healthy. He could literally be prepped for surgery right this very second. He could walk into an operating room, donate a small lobe of his liver, and completely save his father's life without ever needing to bypass the federal organ waitlist or commit medical charity fraud. The medical solution was sitting right there in his own body, but Liam flatly refused to do it. The clinical notes entered by the attending trauma surgeon indicated that the son explicitly declined to be a living donor, citing severe anxiety regarding invasive surgical procedures and a required 6-week physical recovery period that would interfere with his highly active lifestyle. The absolute sickening truth washed over me completely. Liam was fully aware he was a perfect genetic match, but he was too incredibly vain and cowardly to undergo the painful surgery himself. He did not want to endure the physical scarring, the heavy anesthesia, or the long, grueling recovery process. He wanted to preserve his own perfect, wealthy lifestyle completely uninterrupted. So instead of saving his beloved father with his own body, he and Richard engineered a horrific backup plan. They decided to hunt down the discarded daughter. They tracked me to my hospital, specifically to force me into the operating room in his place. They wanted to use my executive administrative power to bypass the federal charity rules, but their ultimate goal was to use my actual physical body. They planned to manipulate my childhood trauma, break down my emotional boundaries, and guilt me into becoming the biological sacrificial lamb so the golden child could keep his perfect abdomen entirely scar-free. Liam was perfectly willing to let me be carved open on a surgical table just so he could avoid taking a few weeks off from his expensive vacations and offshore gambling trips. I stared at the medical compatibility report and felt a profound, chilling calmness settle deeply into my bones. There was no anger left. Anger is an unpredictable emotional response, and I was currently operating on pure calculated logic. Richard and Liam were not just selfish men. They were highly systematic predators who viewed my entire existence as nothing more than a biological and financial resource to be harvested whenever they required it. 30 years ago, Richard harvested my financial identity to save his life. Today, Liam was trying to harvest my organs to save his inheritance. They actually believed I was weak enough to let them do it twice. They thought the vulnerable little girl from the shopping mall was still alive inside me, just waiting for a single scrap of paternal validation. They fundamentally misunderstood exactly who they were dealing with. I highlighted the perfect genetic crossmatch report, proving Liam's absolute refusal to donate. I hit the print command. The heavy office printer hummed loudly, spitting out the final piece of undeniable medical evidence. I gathered the thick stack of printed documents. I had the raw federal billing data from 1996. I had the forged pediatric grant application, proving Richard committed massive identity theft against a 5-year-old child. I had the current genetic compatibility matrix, proving Liam was a perfect donor who simply refused to save his own father out of pure vanity. I placed every single document meticulously inside my heavy leather briefcase, right next to the massive stack of financial fraud documents, and the emergency court injunction Jada and I had secured earlier that afternoon. The entire narrative they had built was a fragile house of cards, and I was holding a massive steel hammer. I locked my computer terminal and turned off the overhead office lights. I stood in the dark, holding the leather handle of my briefcase. Tomorrow morning, Liam was planning to bring his aggressive private attorney to Richard's intensive care suite. He was planning to corner me, threaten my professional career, and force me to sign the surgical consent forms. He thought he was walking into a hospital room to execute a brilliant manipulative victory. He had absolutely no idea that he was actually walking directly into an inescapable federal trap designed and completely controlled by the 2 brilliant women he tried to destroy. I walked out of my office and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The long, dark hospital corridor stretched out before me, perfectly quiet and still. I was entirely ready for the morning. I was ready to watch them lose absolutely everything. I walked through the sliding doors of the intensive care unit at exactly 9 in the morning. The air in this wing was always heavy and sterile, smelling strongly of bleach and clinical anxiety. Inside my leather briefcase was the absolute destruction of the 2 men waiting for me. Liam had sent an urgent administrative message to my office early that morning, demanding a mandatory family meeting in Richard's private suite. He claimed he had reached a critical decision regarding his father's failing health and needed my official hospital oversight to finalize the medical paperwork. I knew exactly what he was actually doing. He was setting his final trap. I took a deep breath, letting the cold, analytical risk manager take complete control of my mind and body. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The private suite was large and heavily equipped with advanced heart monitors and oxygen machines. Richard was lying flat on the adjustable hospital bed wearing a pale blue gown. His skin was a terrible shade of yellow from his failing liver, but his eyes were sharp and highly alert. Liam was standing right next to the bed wearing a pristine charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car. He looked incredibly smug and completely confident. Sitting in a cheap plastic guest chair in the corner of the room was a third man. He wore an ill-fitting brown suit and held a battered leather briefcase on his lap. Liam did not introduce the man formally. He simply pointed to him and told me he had brought his personal legal counsel to ensure this family meeting remained strictly productive. I stood perfectly still near the foot of the hospital bed. I did not offer a polite greeting. I looked directly at Liam and told him to get straight to the point because my time was incredibly valuable. Liam smiled a slow, predatory smile. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick stack of hospital paperwork. He dropped the papers onto the small rolling tray table and pushed them directly toward me. They were standard federal organ donor consent forms alongside a hospital charity waiver bypass authorization. Liam told me that his father was running out of time and the standard legal avenues were simply moving too slowly. He said he knew I possessed the executive administrative power to sign these exact forms right now. He demanded I legally authorize my own biological submission as a living liver donor and officially approve the hospital charity funds to cover the massive surgical costs. I looked back up at him, keeping my face entirely blank. I asked him why in the world he thought I would ever sign away my own organs and risk my career for a man who abandoned me. Liam let out a dark, condescending laugh. He stepped away from the bed and walked directly into my personal space. He lowered his voice into a vicious, threatening whisper. Liam pulled a single sheet of paper from his own pocket and unfolded it. It was a copy of the secondary mortgage document for the luxury estate in Oak Brook. He held it up so I could see the massive $1.8 million loan amount. Then he pointed directly to the signature line at the bottom. He told me the signature belonged to his wife, Jada. Liam looked me dead in the eyes and lied with absolute terrifying conviction. He told me his wife was a highly corrupt corporate auditor who had been secretly using her pristine financial status to run massive real estate fraud schemes behind his back. He claimed Jada had illegally leveraged the property to steal millions of dollars and hide the money in offshore accounts. He said he had just discovered her massive criminal enterprise and was absolutely horrified. Then he dropped his ultimate threat. Liam told me that if I did not pick up a pen and sign the organ donor consent forms right this very second, he was going straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He promised to hand over the mortgage documents and formally testify that Jada was a criminal mastermind laundering money. He said the federal authorities would instantly raid her accounting firm, strip her of her professional licenses, and throw her in federal prison for the next 20 years. Liam smiled cruelly and said he knew Jada and I had recently spoken. He threatened to tell the federal agents that I was an active co-conspirator in her massive financial fraud scheme. He swore he would claim that Jada and I were working together to embezzle medical charity funds to pay off her illegal offshore gambling debts. He wanted to frame Jada for his own massive financial crimes and use the threat of federal prison to blackmail me into becoming a biological spare parts bin. I looked at the greasy lawyer sitting in the corner, who was nodding along silently, validating the horrific extortion attempt. Richard watched me from the hospital bed, his yellow eyes practically glowing with dark anticipation. They believed this complex web of fabricated lies and stolen money was an inescapable trap. Liam pushed the metal tray table closer to my waist and placed a heavy black pen directly on top of the consent forms. He told me I had exactly 2 minutes to make a choice. He said I could either save my father and protect my sister-in-law from a catastrophic federal indictment, or I could walk out the door and watch him burn all of our lives completely to the ground. He actually believed his brilliant blackmail strategy was completely flawless and totally unbreakable. He thought I was just a terrified little girl who would blindly obey him to protect my family. I did not scream, and I did not panic. I simply reached out and picked up the black pen. I held the heavy black pen suspended over the thick surgical consent forms. Liam smiled his arrogant, predatory smile, fully believing he had just successfully checkmated a senior hospital executive. He thought his fabricated threats regarding Jada and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had completely broken my spirit. I looked down at the blank signature line, and then I looked directly up into Liam's dark eyes. I did not sign my name. I slowly clicked the cap back onto the pen and tossed it casually onto the metal tray table. It landed with a sharp clatter that echoed in the quiet hospital room. Liam's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of deep, aggressive confusion. He stepped forward, opening his mouth to scream his blackmail threats all over again, but he never got the chance to speak. Exactly on my predetermined schedule, the heavy wooden door to the intensive care suite swung wide open. The cavalry had officially arrived. Jada walked into the room first. She was not the terrified, betrayed wife Liam thought he left at home. She was dressed in a striking crimson-tailored suit, radiating absolute power and lethal corporate efficiency. Liam physically took a step back, his jaw dropping slightly as his brain tried to process why his wife was standing in his father's hospital room. But Jada was not alone. Walking closely behind her was Jonathan Carter, the chief legal counsel for the entire hospital network. Flanking Jonathan were 2 large men in dark, immaculate suits. They were Special Agent Davis and Special Agent Reed from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Healthcare Fraud Division. The sudden influx of immense legal authority completely sucked the oxygen out of the room. The sleazy private attorney Liam had hired immediately recognized exactly what was happening. The cheap lawyer practically leaped out of his plastic guest chair, his face turning the color of wet ash. He frantically began packing his battered leather briefcase, muttering that he was only retained for family mediation and had absolutely no knowledge of any criminal activity. Jonathan Carter held up a hand and coldly instructed the sleazy lawyer to sit back down and remain completely silent. until the federal agents decided if he was an active accessory to extortion. The lawyer collapsed back into the chair, visibly trembling. Liam looked frantically from the federal agents to me, and then finally to Jada. He desperately tried to activate his charming husband persona. He took a step toward Jada, reaching out his hand, and told her she did not need to be here. He tried to tell her that I was crazy and manipulating the situation. Jada did not even blink. She looked at him with eyes as cold and hard as obsidian. She told him in a perfectly flat voice to keep his mouth completely shut because every single word he spoke from this moment forward was being officially recorded for a federal indictment. Richard's heart monitors began to beep significantly faster in the background. The dying man on the bed realized that the absolute worst-case scenario was currently unfolding in his private suite. I walked over to my heavy leather briefcase sitting on the windowsill. I unclasped the brass locks and pulled out the massive stack of forensic evidence I had printed the night before. I did not look at Liam. I turned my attention entirely to Jonathan Carter and the two federal agents. I spoke in a clear, authoritative voice perfectly suited for a corporate boardroom. I officially reported to the hospital legal counsel and the federal authorities that the patient lying in this bed and his son were actively attempting to extort a senior hospital executive to secure emergency federal charity funds. I explained that Liam had just threatened to fabricate evidence of money laundering against his own wife if I did not legally approve a charity bypass for a liver transplant. The federal agents pulled out their small black notebooks and began writing intently. Liam started to shout, calling me a liar, but Special Agent Davis took a single intimidating step forward, forcing Liam to instantly shut his mouth. I turned my eyes to Richard. He looked small and pathetic, practically swallowed by the hospital bed. I held up the thick medical dossier from 1996. I told the room that the extortion attempt today was actually the secondary crime. I told them the primary crime occurred exactly 30 years ago. I walked closer to the bed, forcing Richard to look directly at the documents in my hands. I told the federal agents that in the spring of 1996, Richard was diagnosed with a catastrophic autoimmune disease requiring a $200,000 experimental biological treatment. I explained that he was entirely uninsured and completely broke. I watched the remaining color completely drain from Richard's yellow face. He knew exactly what I was holding. He began to gasp for air, his frail hands gripping the white hospital sheets. I raised my voice, ensuring every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. I stated clearly that Richard stole the Social Security number of his 5-year-old daughter. He falsified massive pediatric medical records to secure a federal pediatric health grant. He used his own child's identity to pay for his adult experimental treatments and legally attached a massive permanent tax lien to her name. I dropped the 1996 billing records and the forged grant applications directly onto Richard's chest. The papers scattered across the pale blue hospital gown. I looked down at the man who threw me away in a shopping mall. I told him he did not abandon me because he was overwhelmed. I told him he abandoned me to completely sever his ties to a massive federal felony so my mother would never find the crippling debt he buried me under. I told him he sacrificed my entire future so he could walk away clean and build a brand new perfect life with his new son. The room was absolutely dead silent except for the frantic, erratic beeping of the heart monitors. Liam stared at his father in complete, absolute horror. Even the golden child had no idea about the 1996 identity theft. Liam realized in that exact moment that his father was not an innocent victim of circumstance, but a ruthless, calculating monster who had been manipulating both of them for decades. Jonathan Carter, the hospital chief legal counsel, stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked down at the federal grant paperwork resting on Richard's chest and then looked directly at the dying man. Jonathan spoke with absolute clinical detachment. He formally stated that the hospital was officially and permanently revoking Richard's emergency charity application due to gross documented financial misrepresentation. He stated that the hospital would not be liable for a single penny of his ongoing medical care, but the true execution was delivered by Special Agent Davis. The tall federal investigator stepped up to the opposite side of the bed. He looked down at Richard with pure professional disgust. Special Agent Davis explained the strict federal laws governing the National Organ Sharing Registry. He stated that any patient found guilty of chronically defrauding federal medical grants or committing medical identity theft is automatically and permanently disqualified from receiving any organs from the national waitlist. The federal government absolutely prohibits distributing incredibly scarce life-saving resources to individuals who actively destroy the medical financial system. The words hit the room with the force of an exploding bomb. Automatic and permanent disqualification. Richard's eyes rolled back slightly and his breathing became rapid and shallow. He was officially off the list forever. There would be no charity funds. There would be no federal bypass. There would be no anonymous deceased donor saving his life at the last possible second. The only way he could possibly survive now was if a perfect biological match willingly walked into this hospital, agreed to pay the hundreds of thousands of dollars in surgical fees entirely out of pocket, and donated their own organ. I turned my head very slowly and looked directly at Liam. Liam was suddenly sweating profusely, his expensive suit looking suddenly incredibly restrictive. He realized he was the absolute last resort. He was the perfect genetic match. He had the power to save his father right now, but it would cost him his own physical body and massive, unimaginable debt. The trap had perfectly closed around Richard, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own crimes. But the execution was only half finished. I took a deliberate step back, allowing Jada to seamlessly take my place at the front of the room. It was time for the brilliant corporate auditor to dismantle the golden child. I stepped back, letting my dark grey hospital blazer brush against the heavy metal bed frame. Jada stepped smoothly into the space I had just vacated. Her crimson-tailored suit practically glowed against the sterile white hospital walls. She did not look at the dying man on the bed. She looked exclusively at the man she had married. Jada opened her own leather portfolio and pulled out a separate thick stack of highly secure banking documents. She handed them directly to Special Agent Reed. She spoke in a voice so incredibly cold and precise, it could have cut solid glass. Jada officially reported to the federal authorities that her husband Liam had committed massive felony wire fraud and aggravated identity theft against her. She pointed to the documents in the agent's hands. She explained that Liam forged her signature to illegally secure a $1.8 million secondary mortgage on her private estate. She detailed exactly how he routed the stolen funds to illegal offshore gambling syndicates in Macau and the Cayman Islands. She looked directly into Liam's terrified eyes and told him she knew absolutely everything. She told him about the shadow freeze she placed on his accounts at midnight. She told him she watched him humiliate himself at the hospital billing desk trying to use dead credit cards. Liam's jaw trembled violently. The brilliant blackmail strategy he thought he had executed just minutes ago had completely vaporized. He had tried to frame his wife with a fabricated story to extort my organs, but Jada had literally brought the Federal Bureau of Investigation to hand him a real indictment. Special Agent Reed quickly scanned the forged mortgage documents and the international wire routing numbers. The paper trail was absolutely flawless. The agent looked up and gave a sharp nod to his partner. Special Agent Davis stepped directly toward Liam, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He formally announced that Liam was being placed under immediate federal arrest for massive bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and felony extortion. The reality of the heavy steel cuffs clicking open completely broke Liam's fragile psychological facade. The golden child entirely shattered. He backed away from the federal agent, his polished, expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the linoleum floor. He threw his hands up in the air, frantically shaking his head. And then the absolute coward inside him took complete control. Instead of taking a single ounce of responsibility for his massive criminal actions, Liam spun around and pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at his dying father on the hospital bed. His voice cracked, pitching into a high hysterical scream that echoed violently off the sterile walls. He screamed that this was all Richard's fault. He screamed that Richard was the one who dragged him into this massive mess by refusing to just die quietly. Liam completely lost his mind, right in front of the federal agents. He screamed at his father, exposing every single horrific detail of their premeditated plot just to save his own skin. He shouted that he knew he was a perfect biological donor match, but he refused to let a surgeon carve him open like a slaughtered animal. He screamed that he was young and wealthy and he was not going to ruin his perfect physical body or waste months recovering in a miserable hospital bed for a pathetic old man. He admitted at the top of his lungs that Richard had explicitly promised him they could track down the discarded daughter and force her to take the surgical knife instead. He confessed that they planned to use my hospital administration position to bypass the federal charity rules and then manipulate my childhood trauma to force my physical submission. Liam screamed that Richard promised the abandoned girl would be incredibly desperate for their validation and would eagerly give up her liver to finally belong to a real family. Liam was actively trying to throw his own dying father under the bus to secure a lighter federal sentence for himself. Special Agent Davis did not hesitate. He grabbed Liam roughly by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place was incredibly loud. Liam began to sob uncontrollably as the agents read him his Miranda rights and dragged him forcefully out of the intensive care unit. The heavy wooden door swung shut, cutting off the pathetic sounds of Liam crying in the hallway. Jada gave me one final, completely silent nod of absolute profound respect. She turned on her heel, her crimson suit flashing under the fluorescent lights, and walked out of the room, following the federal agents to watch her husband be loaded into a government vehicle. Jonathan Carter, the hospital chief legal counsel, quietly excused himself to finalize the permanent charity disqualification paperwork. Suddenly, the massive intensive care suite was completely empty except for me and the man who threw me away 30 years ago. Richard was left entirely alone. His golden child was gone, permanently locked in federal custody. His stolen luxury estate was gone. His emergency charity funding was completely revoked. He was permanently banned from the National Organ Registry. The heart monitors attached to his failing body began to beep erratically, screaming in high-pitched, terrified warning tones. Richard turned his head slowly on the white pillow. He looked up at me with absolute sheer terror in his yellow eyes. He realized in that final agonizing moment that I was the only person left in the entire world. He looked at the federal organ consent forms resting on his chest. He looked at my empty hands. He opened his mouth, struggling to form a pathetic, desperate plea. I did not let him speak. I looked at him with absolutely zero emotion. I reached out and picked up the federal consent forms. I held them up so he could see the blank signature line one last time. Then I simply let go. I watched the papers flutter through the air and land uselessly on the cold, hard hospital floor. I turned my back to him and walked out the door. 6 months have passed since that chaotic and terrifying morning in the intensive care unit. The brutal, freezing winds of the harsh Chicago winter have finally melted away, giving way to a bright and incredibly promising spring. The heavy, suffocating tension that used to follow me relentlessly through the sterile hospital corridors has completely vanished. 2 weeks after the Federal Bureau of Investigation dragged Liam out of the trauma wing in handcuffs, the hospital board of directors convened a highly secretive emergency administrative meeting. They did not call me into the massive mahogany boardroom to threaten my employment or demand a pathetic public relations apology to appease an angry local news media. They called me into the room to officially offer me the prestigious position of Vice President of Hospital Operations. Marcus Sterling, the cowardly executive who originally tried to use me as a convenient corporate scapegoat, was forced into an early and very quiet retirement due to his massive oversight failures regarding the charity fund vulnerabilities. I moved out of my small risk management office on the lower levels and relocated directly to the top floor executive suite. My new office features massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the entire sprawling city skyline, casting warm, natural light across my polished oak desk. I sit in my ergonomic leather chair every single day, and I make the high-level administrative decisions that actively protect thousands of vulnerable patients from the exact kind of predators my father and brother tried to be. The terrified ghost of the little girl crying by their winter coats in a crowded department store has finally been laid to rest. She's permanently gone, and she has been entirely replaced by a fiercely protective executive who completely controls her own destiny. As for Richard, the cold, hard reality of his massive federal crimes caught up to him with absolute ruthless efficiency. Without Liam there to violently bully the hospital medical staff, and without my administrative executive power to illegally bypass the federal transplant waitlist, he was completely out of options. The federal authorities officially revoked his emergency medical charity application and permanently disqualified him from the National Organ Registry due to his documented history of catastrophic medical fraud. He was swiftly transferred out of his private luxury intensive care suite and moved to a severely underfunded state-run palliative care facility located on the far industrial outskirts of the city. He does not have a private concierge medical team catering to his every single demand. He shares a cramped dark room with 3 other terminally ill patients. There are no expensive high-tech heart monitors, and there is absolutely no VIP treatment. He spends his long, agonizing days lying on a thin, uncomfortable mattress, waiting for his failing liver to finally shut down completely. He has absolutely no visitors to comfort him. He is entirely alone, with nothing but the crushing heavy weight of his own terrible choices. The man who willingly sacrificed his 5-year-old daughter to save his own life is now facing the exact same terrifying isolation he forced upon me 30 years ago. He recklessly gambled my entire life away for a second chance, and he completely wasted it. Liam's spectacular downfall was even more deeply satisfying to watch unfold. The arrogant golden child is no longer wearing $10,000 gold watches or custom-tailored designer suits. He is currently wearing a standard-issue scratchy orange jumpsuit, serving a mandatory 10-year sentence in a high-security federal penitentiary. The federal prosecutors were absolutely merciless, and they did not offer him a generous plea deal. They charged him with multiple severe counts of aggravated identity theft, felony wire fraud, and criminal extortion. The massive $2.5 million luxury estate in Oak Brook was immediately seized by the federal government and sold at public auction to cover a fraction of his massive offshore gambling debts. But the absolute best part of the entire legal process was watching Jada completely destroy his pathetic life in family court, because she acted with such incredible surgical precision, initiating the banking shadow freeze and filing the federal identity theft reports on the exact same day she discovered the forgery. She was completely legally absolved of the massive $1.8 million fraudulent mortgage. The family court judge granted her an expedited divorce, citing extreme criminal financial abuse and fraud. Liam lost his brilliant wife, his stolen wealth, his freedom, and his perfect physical vanity, all in a single devastating legal blow. Jada and I actually met for coffee yesterday afternoon. We chose a small, quiet, independent cafe located right in the bustling heart of the downtown financial district. She walked through the heavy glass doors wearing a stunning ivory-tailored suit, looking absolutely radiant and completely unburdened by the parasitic weight of her former marriage. She had just been officially promoted to senior managing partner at her prestigious corporate accounting firm. We sat across from each other at a small rustic wooden table, sipping our dark black coffee and watching the busy city traffic move rapidly past the window. We did not call each other sister. We did not force any artificial emotional warmth, and we certainly did not make any plans to spend the upcoming holidays together. Our connection is not built on the fragile, toxic obligation of family bloodlines. What we share is something infinitely deeper and far more authentic than that. We share the profound, silent respect of 2 highly intelligent professional women who found themselves trapped inside a raging fire built by arrogant men, and instead of burning to ash, we simply walked out of the flames and locked the doors behind us. We talked excitedly about our respective corporate careers, our future financial investments, and the absolute pure peace of living in a world where we no longer have to carry the dead weight of manipulative liars. When we finally stood up to leave, we shook hands firmly outside the cafe. We walked away in opposite directions, 2 absolute survivors completely in control of our own lives. If I look back at my entire life through a psychological lens, I realize that I spent 30 years suffering from a deeply ingrained sense of conditional self-worth. I believed that because my own biological father threw me away in a shopping mall, I was fundamentally broken and inherently unworthy of genuine human love. I thought I had to constantly bleed myself dry and achieve impossible levels of absolute professional perfection just to justify my basic existence on this earth. Society constantly pushes a very specific and highly toxic narrative about family dynamics. They tell us over and over again that we must forgive our parents no matter what terrible, abusive things they have done to us. They say blood is thicker than water, but blood can also be highly toxic. Blood can be a heavy, suffocating poison that slowly drains the life completely out of you until there is nothing left but an empty shell. Forgiveness is an incredibly personal, private journey, and it is something you do entirely for your own internal peace of mind. But reconciliation is a completely different concept, and nobody in this world has the right to demand access to your life simply because they happen to share your genetic code. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep the people who abandoned you warm. Your personal sacrifices are not a blank check for their continued disrespect, and your childhood trauma is not a biological debt you are ever forced to repay. Setting hard, unyielding boundaries with abusive relatives is not an act of cruel betrayal. It is the ultimate necessary act of pure self-preservation and profound self-love. You do not need anyone's permission to demand basic human respect. And you absolutely do not need a hollow apology from the exact people who broke you in order to start healing yourself. Sometimes the absolute best revenge you can ever achieve is simply surviving, thriving, and completely forgetting the people who actively tried to destroy your future. If you have ever had to make the terrifying, incredibly painful decision to cut off toxic family members to protect your own mental and physical peace, I want you to type "no more" in the comments right now. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue building this incredible supportive community of survivors together. Let me know exactly where you are watching from today and what time it is in your part of the world. Your engagement and support help these critical stories reach the exact people who desperately need to hear them the most. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredibly long and difficult journey. I truly hope my story gives you the absolute courage and strength to stand up tall and reclaim your own narrative from the people who tried to steal it. Until next time, please always remember that you are the author of your own worth. You define your value in this world, and nobody else ever gets to hold the pen.